Clara Whitmore threw the last of her dead husband's coins onto the land office counter and didn't look at the man behind the desk even once. Her hands weren't shaking. That surprised her. 2 weeks ago, she'd been pulling splinters from a wagon wheel with her bare fingers, trying not to think about how James had been alive when that wheel broke and dead before sundown. Now she was buying the one piece of land in Colfax County that nobody else would touch, a crumbling cliff face above Red Hollow that the locals called the Widow's Grave. She signed her name. Every person in that office laughed. Clara folded the deed, tucked it against her chest, and walked out into the Colorado heat without saying a single word. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe and follow along. I want to know how far this story travels, so drop your city in the comments below and let me know you're watching. Now stay with me, because what this woman did next changed everything. The laughter followed her all the way down the main street of Red Hollow. She could hear them through the thin plank walls of the land office as she stepped out onto the boardwalk. The clerk, 2 ranchers who'd been waiting on deeds of their own, and the woman who swept the floors every Tuesday morning. All of them laughing. Not the polite kind of laughter that stops when it's gone too far. The other kind. The kind that doesn't care if you hear it. Clara kept walking. She had James's saddlebag over one shoulder, her grandfather's journals tucked under her left arm, and $19.40 left to her name. The deed to the Cliff property was pressed flat against her ribs, still warm from where she'd signed it. She could feel every edge of that paper through the fabric of her dress. Her younger brother Eli was waiting beside the wagon at the far end of the street. He was 16, all elbows and worry, and the moment he saw her face, he straightened up like he was bracing for bad news. "You did it," he said. "I did it." He looked at the empty saddlebag, then back at her. "Clara, that was everything." "I know what it was. We don't have anything left. We have the land." Eli looked away down the street, jaw tight. "People are staring at us. Let them stare." She climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Eli climbed up beside her, and she clucked the horse forward, without another word. The main street of Red Hollow was narrow and dusty, and lined on both sides with people who had opinions about her. She could feel every last one of those opinions, like heat through glass. A woman outside the dry goods store leaned toward her neighbor and said something with her hand covering her mouth, and the neighbor glanced at Clara and looked away fast. 2 men on the steps of the feed store watched the wagon pass without saying anything at all, which was somehow worse. Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead. She'd learned early that looking people in the eye when they were pitying you only gave them permission to pity you more. Her husband had been dead for 18 days. 18 days since the wheel of the grain wagon had split on the ridge road and James had gone down with it into the gully. 18 days since she'd sat in the dirt beside him for 3 hours before a passing rider had stopped and understood what he was looking at. 18 days since she'd become the kind of woman people whispered about. She was 19 years old. She was a widow. She was, according to the women at the church social, that poor heavy girl with no family and no prospects, and Lord only knows what she's going to do. What she was going to do was buy the cliff. She'd known it for 2 years, ever since she'd found her grandfather's journals in a box her mother had left behind when she died. Her grandfather, Thomas Pruitt, had spent 20 years in the Colorado Territory before the war, and he'd kept records the way other men kept cattle, methodically, obsessively, in small, careful handwriting that filled 6 leather-bound books. He'd written about the land around Red Hollow with the precision of a man who believed everything he observed was worth preserving. He'd written about the cliff especially. He'd called it the most misread geography in the county, and spent 43 pages explaining why. Clara had read those pages so many times, she could recite them in her sleep. Nobody else had ever read them at all. That was the difference between her and every man who'd ever looked at that cliff and seen nothing. The Cliff property was 3 miles east of town, up a switchback road that discouraged casual visitors by design. The previous owner had been a speculator from Kansas City who'd bought it in 1871, thinking there might be silver in the rock face, and abandoned it in 1873 when there wasn't. The county had held the deed since then, dropping the price every 2 years until even the price was embarrassing. Clara had paid $47 for 11 acres of vertical rock, a stand of scrubby juniper, and what most people assumed was absolutely nothing. What most people assumed was wrong. She knew that the moment the wagon crested the last rise, and she saw the cliff again, the pale sandstone catching the afternoon light, the deep shadow of the overhang cutting across the southern face, the long flat shelf of rock at the base where her grandfather had noted the soil was 6 inches deeper than anywhere around it and held moisture twice as long. "It's still ugly," Eli said. "It's still ours," Clara said. Eli climbed down from the wagon and stood looking up at the cliff face with his hands on his hips. He was trying to see what she saw. She knew that. He'd been trying since she'd first shown him the journals 3 months ago, after James died, and the question of what to do next had become unavoidable. "Grandfather wrote that the water table under this shelf runs about 40 feet down," she said. "That's accessible with the right kind of well casing. He mapped the drainage pattern off the overhang. Rain comes off that rock face and concentrates right here." She pointed to a narrow channel worn into the stone. "He said a collection basin in that notch could hold enough water through a dry season to sustain crops on the shelf." Grandfather also spent the last 10 years of his life alone in a cabin talking to his horse. He was right about the land, Eli. Eli kicked at the ground, and a small puff of red dust rose and settled. "We need shelter before we need water. We need both." "Clara, we need both," she said again quietly. "I know how to get both. Help me unload the wagon." They slept that first night under an overhang of rock that smelled like dust and juniper and something older, a deep mineral cold that came up from the stone itself. Clara lay on her back with her grandfather's journal stacked beside her and listened to Eli's breathing, even out into sleep, and then listened to the silence beyond that. The silence in Colorado was different from anything she'd expected when she'd come west with James 3 years ago from Ohio. Ohio had a kind of quiet that was soft and damp and full of small sounds, frogs, creek, water, wind in the corn. Colorado quiet was harder. It had weight to it. It pressed down on you. She didn't find it frightening. She found it clarifying. She lay there in the dark and thought about William Carter. William Carter was the largest landowner in Red Hollow and had been, according to everyone who'd ever mentioned his name in her presence for the past 20 years. He was a tall man, with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life had to worry about a bill. He owned the Carter Ranch south of town, the Carter Mill on the creek, and apparently also a substantial portion of the opinions of everyone who lived within 30 miles. He had come to see her 4 days after James died. She'd been sitting on the porch of the small house she and James had been renting at the edge of town, and she'd heard the horse before she saw the rider. Carter had dismounted with the deliberate ease of a man performing graciousness for an audience, even though there was no audience, only Clara and Eli and a dead yard. "Mrs. Whitmore," he'd said, removing his hat, "I wanted to come pay my respects personally." "Thank you," she'd said. He'd stood there holding his hat against his chest and looked at her with what she recognized as the particular expression men wear when they've already decided what someone's story is going to be before that person has said a word. "I understand you're in a difficult position," he said. "Your husband didn't leave much behind." "No. I've spoken to Pastor Green about the Widow's Relief Fund. There's enough to keep you and your brother fed through the fall if you're careful." "That's kind." He'd tilted his head slightly the way a man does when he's about to say the real thing. "Mrs. Whitmore. Clara, I want you to think seriously about your situation. You're young, you're alone. This isn't a country that's gentle to women in your circumstances." He paused. "There's a family in Denver looking for a housekeeper. The work is honest and the pay is fair, and they've said they'd consider taking on a girl your age. I could write the letter." Clara had looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Carter," she said, "thank you for coming. I appreciate the thought." He'd waited. "I won't be needing the letter," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite irritation, but close to it. The cliff property won't sustain a life, he said, because somehow he'd already heard, because Red Hollow was the kind of town where everyone heard everything. I looked at that land myself in 1875. There's nothing there. Rock and sky and hard luck. My grandfather studied it for 20 years, Clara said. Your grandfather studied a lot of things, Carter said with the particular gentleness of a man dismissing someone else's dead. The land still doesn't have water. The land has water, she said, 40 feet down, and rain capture in the stone shelf, and southern exposure for the growing season. My grandfather wrote all of it down. Carter had looked at her the way people look at something that is technically a person, but that they've already filed away as a category rather than an individual. A young woman, heavy-set, newly widowed, talking about her grandfather's journals. He saw the category. He did not see Clara. I hope it works out for you, he said, replacing his hat. He rode away. Clara went inside and started packing. The work on the cliff began the morning after their first night. Clara had studied the journals long enough that she knew the order of operations as clearly as a recipe. Water first. Everything depended on water. She'd used the last $12 of her money to purchase a second-hand well auger from a man in town who'd given it to her with the expression of someone handing a child a tool they will soon regret requesting. She and Eli spent the first 3 days working in shifts, drilling down through the sandstone shelf in the spot her grandfather had marked. It was harder than the journals described. Her grandfather had been a man of significant physical strength, and he'd also been writing in a voice that smoothed over difficulty, the way all journals do, the way you say, "We crossed the river," and don't say, "The water was so cold, my hand stopped working right, and I had to be pulled out by the horse." The drilling was bone-deep exhausting, and the August heat came off the rock face like a second sun, and Eli gave up on his hat on the second day and wrapped his head in a strip of cloth instead, and still the sweat ran into his eyes so badly he could barely see the auger head. Clara drilled when he couldn't. She was broader through the shoulders than Eli, and she'd learned in the months of watching James work the farm how to let her weight work for her rather than against her, how to lean into resistance rather than fight it, how to use her whole body as a lever rather than just her arms. The townspeople didn't see that, of course. What they saw, what the 3 or 4 of them who rode out on the switchback road to look saw, was a heavy young woman covered in red dust, working a well auger in the August heat on a piece of land that everyone agreed was worthless, and they turned their horses around and went back to Red Hollow and told each other what they'd seen. Clara heard what they said eventually because everything came back eventually in a place that small. "She's going to kill herself out there," one woman said, and meant it as criticism rather than concern. "That fat girl doesn't know the first thing about wells," said a man at the feed store, who had himself drilled exactly 1 well in his life 30 years ago under the supervision of his father and 2 hired hands. "She ought to be in Denver," said someone else, meaning she ought to be somewhere I don't have to think about her. Clara heard all of it. She kept drilling. On the 4th day, at 38 feet, the auger head broke through into wet earth. Eli was at the bottom of the shaft, and she heard him say quietly at first, and then louder, "Clara, Clara, come down here. Come down right now." She went down hand over hand on the rope and crouched beside him in the cramped dark and put her palm flat against the earth and felt it. Damp, not soaking, not a gusher, not the kind of dramatic underground river her grandfather had maybe slightly overpromised in the journals, but real moisture rising from below, and when they worked the auger another 6 inches, it came up muddy and then wetter, and by mid-morning, water was pooling at the bottom of the shaft in a way that was quiet and certain and completely real. Eli sat back against the shaft wall and laughed. Not his normal laugh, something stripped of everything except relief. "He was right," Eli said. "I know he was right," Clara said. "You knew he was right?" "Yes." "Before you knew the whole time?" "I knew," she said. Eli looked at the water pooling at their feet. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry I doubted you." "You were being sensible," she said. "Sensible people doubted this." She paused. "That's why sensible people didn't buy it first." Ethan Walker came to the cliff on a Thursday in September. Clara didn't know him when she first saw him coming up the switchback road, just a man on a brown horse moving easy, not in any hurry. She'd been working on the stone terrace all morning, her hands raw from the chisel work, and she straightened up and watched him come, and kept her expression neutral, because men arrived on this road sometimes for a variety of reasons that required a woman on her own to be careful. He stopped the horse the respectful distance from where she was standing and tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "I'm Ethan Walker. I run the smithy up at Millard Creek." "Morning," she said. She didn't give her name, not yet. "I heard about the well," he said. "Word travels." "It does." He looked at the cliff face, and she watched his eyes move across it with something that was not the usual expression, not dismissal, not pity, not the particular calculating look of a man trying to figure out what he could get from this situation. He looked the way people look at something they're genuinely trying to understand. "What are you building there?" he said, nodding toward the terrace. "Stone terraces. For cultivation." "How many?" "4, eventually. I've got the first one level. The second one's giving me trouble. There's a fault line in the rock at the north end, and the stone keeps splitting the wrong direction." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of chisel are you using?" she told him. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "That's a general-purpose chisel. For fault line work in sandstone, you want a narrower head, less surface area, so you're not distributing force across the split. You want to direct it." He paused. "I could make you one. Wouldn't take more than a day." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and there was nothing in his expression that she needed to be careful about. "Why?" she said. He thought about that. "Because what you're doing here is interesting," he said. "And because I've been in Red Hollow for 7 years, and I've watched people do a lot of things that weren't interesting, and because—" He stopped. Looked at the cliff again. "Because my father built something people said was impossible, and I watched him do it, and I've been looking for someone doing the same thing ever since, just to see if it could happen twice." Clara studied him for a long moment. "What did your father build?" she said. "Bridge over the Millard Creek Gorge," he said. "Everyone said the gorge was too wide and the current was too strong. Took him 4 years and he lost 2 fingers doing it. It's still there." "Is your father still here?" "No, ma'am. Passed 8 years ago." "I'm sorry." "He knew what he'd built," Ethan said. "That's the part that mattered to him. Clara looked at the cliff at the half-finished terrace at the water system she'd sketched out in her own notebook beside her grandfather's notes, the notch in the rock that was going to catch the rain off the overhang and direct it to the storage cistern she hadn't built yet. "I could use the chisel," she said. He brought it the next day, and the day after that he came back without any particular reason given and helped her shift a stone that was too large for one person to move without risking injury. And the day after that, he came back again, and they worked in the early morning quiet before the heat built up, and he didn't say much, and she didn't say much, and neither of them needed to. Eli watched all of this with the careful attention of a boy who has learned to read weather. "He keeps coming back," Eli said one evening when Ethan had ridden back down the switchback road. "He's helpful," Clara said. "He could be helpful from Millard Creek." "Eli, I'm just saying." "Don't just say," she said not unkindly. Eli went quiet. Then, "Do you trust him?" Clara thought about Ethan Walker's hands on the stones that afternoon, the economy of his movement, the way he'd watched the fault line in the rock before he placed the chisel, the care he took with things that were fragile. "So far," she said. "Yes." October arrived cold and clear, and the first of the stone terraces was finished. Clara stood at the top of it in the early morning and looked at what they'd built, the level stone surface, catching the flat October light. The channel that would direct water from the cistern down along the east wall, the windbreak of junipers she and Eli had transplanted from the north end of the property to shelter the growing space from the worst of the Colorado winters. It didn't look like much, maybe. To someone coming up that switchback road for the first time, it might have looked like a narrow rocky shelf, a rough stone wall, and a stand of small, scraggly trees. Not the kind of thing you'd put in a painting. But Clara knew what it meant. It meant that next spring, when the ground softened, there would be somewhere to plant. It meant that the water in the cistern, already 12 inches deep from the October rains that had come off the overhang, exactly where her grandfather's journals said they would be available for irrigation when everything else around Red Hollow was waiting on the creek. She was thinking about next spring when Eli appeared beside her, his breath making small clouds in the cold. "Man coming up the road," he said. She turned. The rider was still far enough away that she couldn't make out the face, but she recognized the horse. She'd seen that horse tied outside the bank and the Carter Ranch office enough times to know it. "Carter," she said. Eli's jaw tightened. "You want me to go down and meet him?" "No, let him come up." Carter arrived at the base of the cliff looking exactly the same as he always looked. Well-dressed, deliberate, the hat coming off when he addressed a woman, even when the woman in question was someone he'd already decided about. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "I wanted to come see how you were getting on." "Getting on well, thank you." He looked at the terrace. He looked at the water channel. He looked at the row of junipers and the cleared planting bed and the well casing she and Ethan had lined with stone to keep the walls from crumbling. He was quiet for longer than usual. "This is more than I expected," he said finally. "I imagine it is," she said. He looked at her, not the category this time, or at least not quite. Something had shifted in his expression. "The water's real." "I told you the water was real." "You did," he said. "I didn't believe you." He paused. "That was a mistake." Clara looked at him. In another story, this was the moment she might have been gracious about. It might have said it was all right, might have given him something easy to walk away with. But she'd spent the last 3 months drilling through sandstone and sleeping under a rock overhang and listening to the drift of talk from Red Hollow that reached her even up here, and she was not in the market for gracious just at this moment. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I told you exactly what this land was, and you told me I was wrong, and then you went back to town and told everyone else the same thing. I'd like you to think about the difference between a mistake and a choice." He held her gaze. "That's fair," he said quietly. "I know it is." He looked at the terrace one more time. "The county's going to need people who know how to hold water," he said, and his voice had lost some of its usual ease. "It's been a dry year. I don't know that next year will be better." "I know it won't," Clara said. He looked at her. "My grandfather's journals mapped the rainfall patterns for this valley going back to 1851, she said. "The dry cycles run 7 to 9 years. We had a wet decade. We're due." She paused. "I've been watching the creek levels since March. They're down 18 inches from where they should be this time of year." Carter was quiet for a long time. "What do you think comes next?" he said, and the ease was entirely gone now. He was asking a real question. "I think the creek drops another foot by spring," she said. "I think the wells on the south end of the valley go dry by July. I think the summer of 1885 is going to be the hardest year Red Hollow has ever seen." She watched him process that. "What are you going to do about it?" he said. "I'm going to be ready," she said. "The question is whether the rest of the valley will be." He put his hat back on. He looked like a man who'd ridden up a switchback road, expecting to find confirmation of what he already believed, and had found something else entirely. "May I come back?" he said. "To talk more." "You may come back," Clara said, "when you're ready to listen, rather than just look." He nodded slowly. He rode back down the road. Eli appeared at her shoulder. "Was that more civil than you wanted to be?" "A little," she said. "He's going to come back. I know he is." Eli was quiet. Then, "You knew about the dry cycle. You knew before we even bought the land." "That's part of why I bought it." "Clara." He stopped. "You planned all of this. Before James, even before that. You had this whole thing." "I had grandfather's journals," she said. "I had the knowledge. I just needed the moment." Eli stared at her. The moment was James dying. The words hit the air between them, and neither of them moved. The moment was being free to make my own choice, Clara said quietly. I loved James. I'm not going to apologize for also knowing what I was going to do when I was free to do it. Eli didn't say anything. After a while, he put his arm around her shoulders, and she let him, and they stood together at the top of the finished terrace and looked out across the valley below, where the creek ran thin and pale in the October light, 12 miles of diminishing water moving toward a future that only one person in Red Hollow had read the signs for. The wind came off the cliff face cold and sharp. Clara pulled her coat tighter and thought about spring. The cold that settled over Red Hollow that November was the kind that got into the walls of a building and stayed there. Clara felt it every morning when she woke before dawn on the cliff, the stone beneath her bedroll holding the night's chill long after the sun had crested the eastern ridge. She'd learned to start the fire fast and keep it small. Wood was something she was rationing now, same as everything else, and she'd drink her coffee standing up, already thinking about the day's work before the cup was half empty. Eli said she didn't sleep anymore. He said it the way younger brothers say things, which is to say out loud, and without any particular invitation to respond. I sleep, she said. You lie down, he said. That's different. She didn't argue the point, because he wasn't entirely wrong. There was too much to think about. The second terrace still needed 3 more courses of stone along the north wall. The cistern had a slow seep at the eastern joint she hadn't been able to seal properly with the materials she had. The planting calculations she'd worked out from her grandfather's journals assumed a late frost date of mid-April, but the winter coming in felt harder than average, and she was trying to figure out whether she needed to revise her numbers or trust the data. And underneath all of it, constant as a low note held on a fiddle string, was the awareness of the creek. She checked it every time she rode into town. She kept a mark on a stone at the crossing point, a scratch she'd made with her pocket knife the first week of September, measuring from the water line. By the end of November, the water had dropped 4 inches below that mark. 4 inches in 3 months. Nobody else was measuring. That was the thing that kept her awake more than the cold or the cistern seep or the stone calculations. She'd ride through town and see men going about their business. Carter's hands moving cattle the mill wheel, turning on what was left of the current. Farmers talking about spring planting. Like spring was going to look the same as every spring before it, and she'd feel the particular loneliness of knowing something that nobody around you believes is worth knowing. She'd felt that feeling before. She'd felt it every time she walked into a room in Red Hollow and watched people's eyes move over her and away, cataloging what they saw and finding it wanting. Too heavy. Too young. Too quiet. Too strange. The category settled around her so fast in this town that the actual Clara, the one who'd read her grandfather's 6 journals cover to cover 4 times, the one who could calculate a drainage gradient in her head, the one who'd spent 3 months turning a useless cliff into something that would outlast everyone who'd laughed at it. That Clara didn't even get a chance to introduce herself before the verdict was in. She'd learned to carry that. She hadn't learned to like it. Ethan Walker came up the switchback road on a Tuesday in late November with a length of waterproof sealing compound he'd mixed himself and a look on his face that said he'd heard something in town worth telling her about. She knew his face well enough by now to read it before he said a word. He'd developed a habit over the past 2 months of arriving in the morning and staying through the workday. And she'd developed a corresponding habit of trusting his judgment about stones and metals, and the load-bearing properties of things, which was a significant concession from a woman who'd spent most of her adult life trusting no one's judgment but her own. "What happened?" she said before he'd even dismounted. He got down from the horse and handed her the sealing compound. "Garrett Haynes lost his east well." She stilled. Garrett Haynes had the property 3 miles south of town near the Old Creek Fork. His east well was one of the deepest in the valley. Her grandfather had noted it in the journals as sitting on a secondary aquifer that ran parallel to the main one. "How deep was it?" she said. 62 feet, Ethan said. "Run dry in 4 days. He said it just dropped. He went out Sunday morning and it was low. By Wednesday it was gone." Clara turned the ceiling compound over in her hands. "That's the secondary aquifer," she said half to herself. "If the secondary's failing, the main one's under pressure. The wells on the south end of town are going to start showing it by January." "That's what you think." "That's what the data says." He watched her face. "You're not surprised." "No? You've been expecting this." "I've been preparing for it," she said, which was not quite the same thing as expecting it, but close enough that she didn't bother drawing the distinction. She looked up at the cliff face at the cistern wall at the second terrace that was 3 courses of stone from finished. "We need to move faster," she said. "On the terrace. On everything." She handed the ceiling compound back to him. "The cistern first. Show me what you brought." They worked on the cistern joint for the rest of the morning, Ethan applying the compound in careful, even layers, while Clara held the stone face steady from the inside. It was close, cold work, crouched in the shadow of the cistern wall, with the smell of the sealant sharp in the air, and they talked while they worked. The way people talk when their hands are busy. Practical, factual, with spaces in between that were comfortable rather than awkward. "How much water are you holding right now?" he said. "About 40 gallons. The October rains brought in more than I projected. The overhang catchment is working better than grandfather's calculations suggested. The angle might be steeper than he measured." She paused. "If we get a normal snowpack this winter, and I can get the upper catchment channel finished by March, I'm projecting close to 200 gallons by the time planting season starts." 200, Ethan said. He said it the way people say a number when they're doing the math behind it. "That's enough for me and Eli and the first 2 terraces, yes, with careful management. And if others need it." She was quiet for a moment. "That depends on how many others and how careful," she said. Ethan smoothed the last of the compound along the joint and sat back. "People in town are going to start understanding what's happening," he said. "When Garrett's story gets around, they're going to look for someone who knew before them. They're going to look for someone to blame," she said. "Maybe both." She pulled herself out of the cistern and stood up straight, her back aching from the crouch. "I'm not interested in being blamed for a drought I predicted and they ignored." "No," he said. "But you might be interested in being the person who can help when it gets bad enough." She looked at him. He was sitting on the edge of the cistern with the empty compound tin between his hands, and he was looking at her with the direct, unhurried attention she'd come to recognize as simply the way he looked at things he took seriously. Not a category, not a verdict, just attention. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about what you said to Carter," he said. "About being ready. I think you're already thinking about more than just you and Eli." She looked away toward the half-finished upper terrace. "I'm thinking about the valley," she said. "I'm thinking about what happens to 60 families when their wells go dry in July and they haven't planted anything that can survive on rationed water." She paused. "I'm thinking about whether knowing something in advance obligates you to share it before people are ready to hear it." "What did you decide?" "I decided I'd get the terraces built first," she said. "Because you can't teach someone what water conservation looks like. You have to show them." He nodded slowly. "And when they come up here to look, then I'll show them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Carter's going to come back." "I know." "What are you going to tell him?" "The truth," she said. "Same as last time. Whether he listens is his problem." Ethan picked up the empty tin and stood. He was a tall man, not heavy, but broad the way men get who work metal for a living, and he moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste effort. He'd told her once that his father had said the most dangerous thing a man could do was confuse being forceful with being effective. She'd thought about that more than once since then. "I'll come back Thursday," he said. "I want to look at the upper catchment channel before the ground freezes." "Thursday's good," she said. He walked to his horse and she expected him to mount and ride, but he stopped with one hand on the saddle and turned back. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "What you're building here." He stopped, started again. "I've been in this valley a long time. I've watched people survive it, and I've watched people fail it. What you're building is the kind of thing that changes a place." He paused. "I want you to know I see that." She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. "Not the small, courteous kind of thank you. The real kind." He nodded and rode down the switchback road, and she stood watching him go for a moment before she turned back to the cliff and the long day of work, still waiting. Eli appeared from the direction of the upper terrace, where he'd been moving stone all morning. He had dust in his hair, and that careful younger brother expression on his face again. "He sees it," Eli said. "I heard what he said." "I mean, he sees you," Eli said. "Not just the project. You." Clara picked up her chisel and walked toward the terrace. "Get back to work," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Eli said, grinning, which was the most aggravating possible response, and he knew it. She kept walking and did not let him see that she was smiling too. December came in hard. The first real snow hit the valley in the second week of the month, and Clara and Eli spent 3 days reinforcing the shelter against the wind before they could get back to work on the terraces. The snow was actually useful. She'd calculated for it, planned the upper catchment channel to direct snowmelt toward the cistern, the same way it directed rain, and the first significant snowfall told her the channel was working correctly, because by the end of the thaw, she had 8 more gallons in the cistern than she'd started with. She wrote the number in her own notebook beside her grandfather's old calculations, and felt for a moment the specific satisfaction of a thing working the way you designed it to work. Then she rode into town for supplies and found Red Hollow in a state she hadn't seen before. It was a Wednesday, and the main street was busier than it should have been for a Wednesday in December. There were groups of men standing outside the feed store, and outside the bank, and outside Carter's mill office, and the conversations had the particular quality of conversations that have been happening for a while and have stopped being easy. She pulled up at the dry goods store and went inside. And Martha Hensley, who ran the store with her husband, and had never once in 6 months given Clara more than minimum necessary acknowledgement, actually looked up from the counter and held her gaze. "You heard about the Dunmore well," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "I just got in from the cliff," Clara said. "What happened?" "Dry as a bone since Monday. Roy Dunmore says it dropped 6 inches in a week and then just stopped." Martha's voice was flat and controlled in the way of someone keeping fear at a conversational distance. "That's 2 wells in 6 weeks." "Which aquifer does Dunmore draw from?" Clara said. Martha blinked. "I don't know. Does it matter?" "Yes," Clara said. She was moving through the store picking up what she needed, her mind running the geography of the valley's water table. Dunmore's property was north of Haynes's on the other side of the creek fork. If the northern wells were going too, the failure wasn't isolated to the secondary aquifer. It was the main table dropping. She was 6 months early in her projection. That stopped her in the middle of the flour aisle. She stood there for a moment, a 5-pound sack in each hand, recalculating. Her grandfather's data showed the dry cycles running 7 to 9 years, with the most severe years concentrated in the middle of the cycle. She'd placed them in 1886. But her grandfather's data was from the 1850s and 1860s, and there were things he hadn't been able to account for: grazing patterns, the mill drawing water from the creek, the upstream diversion Carter had put in 3 years ago to irrigate the south pasture. Human intervention had accelerated the depletion. They weren't in the early drought. They were already in the middle of it. She set the flour sacks on the counter and paid and carried her supplies out to the wagon, and sat for a moment on the wagon seat with her hands on the reins and her mind running calculations that kept coming out to the same answer. Summer of 1885 was not going to be the hard year. The hard year was already here. She drove back to the cliff faster than usual, and when she got there, she didn't unload the wagon right away. She went inside and got her grandfather's journals and her own notebook, and sat down at the small table she and Eli had built from scrap lumber, and went through every page she'd marked about the valley's water patterns. Eli came in an hour later and found her there surrounded by open books. 2 wells now, she said before he could ask. He pulled up the other chair. How bad? Worse than I thought. Carter's upstream diversion changed the math. She showed him the page where she'd been working. I had the critical failure point at summer 1886. I think it's summer 1885. Eli stared at her numbers. That's 6 months from now. Yes. And the valley's they haven't. No, she said. They haven't done anything. He was quiet. He knew better than to ask if she was sure. He'd been watching her work long enough to understand the difference between her being uncertain and her being certain about something nobody wanted to hear. What do we do? He said. We finish the terraces, she said. We expand the cistern, and then... She stopped. Then I need to talk to Carter again. Eli looked up. Carter? He came here in October because he was worried. I sent him away. I think it's time I go to him. He treated you like... I know how he treated me, she said. I also know he's the only person in this valley with enough land and enough influence to get people to change what they're doing before it's too late. She looked at her brother. I'd rather swallow my pride in December than watch people lose everything in July. Eli was quiet for a long time. You're going to walk into his office, he said slowly. Yes. And tell him you were right. I'm going to tell him we were both wrong, him about me about the timeline. She closed the top journal. And I'm going to tell him what I think needs to happen before spring. What does need to happen? She told him. By the time she was done, Eli was sitting very still with the expression of someone who has just realized that the person across the table from them has been playing a longer game than they understood. That's not a small thing, he said. No, she said. It's not. You've been planning this since before we moved up here. I've been preparing for it, she said. Same answer as before. He shook his head slowly. You are the most. He stopped. Grandfather would have loved you. Grandfather taught me everything, she said. He just didn't know he was doing it. She went to see Carter 3 days later on a Saturday morning when she knew he'd be in his office at the mill, reviewing the week's accounts. She rode in from the cliff in the hard December cold and tied her horse outside the mill and walked in without sending word ahead, which was a deliberate choice. She wanted to see his first unguarded reaction to her appearing in his space on her terms. He was at his desk when she walked through the door, and he looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who hasn't been surprised in a long time and is now surprised. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Mr. Carter, she said. I need 20 minutes of your time. He leaned back in his chair. He was weighing something. She could see it, whether to make her wait, whether to establish some kind of order to this that had him in the more comfortable position. Then he gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down, he said. She sat. She put her notebook on his desk and opened it to the page with the Valley water table calculations. The Haynes well failed in November, she said. The Dunmore well failed 2 days ago. I believe both failures are connected to your upstream diversion, drawing down the main aquifer faster than natural recharge can support. She watched him. I'm not saying that to blame you. I'm saying it because you need to understand the mechanism before you can understand the solution. Carter looked at the notebook. He looked at her. You mapped this, he said. My grandfather mapped the original water patterns. I updated the calculations to account for changes in land use over the past 20 years. And your conclusion, 6 to 8 additional wells will fail before July, she said. The creek will drop below viable mill operation level by May at the current draw rate. South pasture irrigation has to stop immediately, which means your winter cattle operation needs to change. She paused. And every farmer in this valley needs to convert at least 30% of their acreage to drought-tolerant cultivation before spring planting, or they're going to lose their entire yield. The room was very quiet. Carter looked at the notebook for a long time. You're asking me to tell my neighbors to change everything they know about farming their own land, he said. I'm asking you to help me explain to them why it matters, she said. Because they won't hear it from me. He looked up. Why not? You know why not, she said. He did. She watched him know. It watched the slight tension around his eyes that meant he was feeling something he'd rather not feel. Because you're young, she said. A widow. A woman who lives on a cliff. She held his gaze steadily. Because I look the way I look, and I came from where I came from, and I don't fit the shape of a person whose knowledge this valley is willing to trust. She said it without heat, the way you state a fact. But you do. Carter was quiet. I'm right about the water, she said. You know I am. You came to my cliff in October because you could already see it. What I'm asking is for you to use your standing in this community to help people do something about it before it's too late to do anything. He looked at her for a long moment. What would you need from me? He said. A meeting, she said. All the landowners in the valley before the end of January. You call it, you chair it. I'll present the data and you back it up. And if they don't believe the data, they'll believe it when the next well goes dry, she said. I'd rather they believe it before that. He was quiet again. She let the silence sit. She'd learned that with men like Carter, patience was more effective than pressure. The upstream diversion, he said finally. You said it needs to stop. Yes. That's going to cost me significantly. Yes, she said. It is. You're asking me to take a financial loss to prove a point that the rest of the valley might not accept. I'm asking you to take a calculated loss now to prevent a catastrophic one later, she said. You're a businessman, Mr. Carter. You understand sunk costs. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite admiration, he wasn't ready for that, but it was the particular expression of a man who has revised upward his estimate of what he's dealing with. You've done this before, he said, presented an argument. I've prepared for it, she said. There's a difference. No, he said slowly. I don't think there is. Not for you. He looked at the notebook again. He picked it up. She let him because she had her grandfather's journals at the cliff, and she could reconstruct every number on this page from memory. And he read through her calculations slowly and carefully in a way that told her he was a man who understood numbers which she'd suspected but not confirmed until this moment. When he put it down, something had changed. January 15th, he said. I'll call the meeting for the 15th. I want you there from the start, not brought in after. He paused. And I want to see the full documentation. Journals and all. Done, she said. She stood. He stood too. The reflex of courtesy, she thought, though, maybe more than that. He held out his hand, and she shook it, and his grip was direct and equal, not the careful, reduced-pressure handshake men sometimes gave women, as if they might break. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Mr. Carter. For what it's worth, he said, I was wrong about the land. I know you were, she said. I'd rather you be right about this. She walked out of this mill office into the December cold and untied her horse and rode back toward the cliff, and the feeling that rode with her was not triumph. She'd learned to be suspicious of triumph. It had a way of arriving too early, but something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a door opening. The feeling of ground shifting under a weight it had been pretending not to feel for a long time. The creek crossing on the way back was lower than it had been on the way into town. She measured it against her knee and made a note in her head and kept riding. January arrived, and with it a cold so deep the air felt like it was made of something harder than air. Clara had finished the second terrace by then, and she and Eli had begun breaking ground on the third in the brief window between snowfalls, when the soil was cold but workable. The cistern held 90 gallons now. She'd started the seedling propagation in a small windbreak shelter she'd built against the south cliff face, using the solar warmth her grandfather's journals had identified, and she'd confirmed with a month of temperature records. 3 things happened in the first 2 weeks of January that accelerated everything. The first was that Roy Dunmore's second well failed. He'd drilled a new one in November when the first went dry, trusting the valley's water table at a new location, spending money he apparently couldn't easily afford on a driller who came in from the east. The new well ran for 6 weeks, and then dropped, and then dried, and Roy Dunmore showed up at Clara's cliff on a Tuesday afternoon looking like a man who has just been told something he'd been trying not to believe. He stood at the base of the switchback with his hat in his hands, which was notable because Roy Dunmore was not a hat-in-hands kind of man. He was 53 years old, and had been farming the same piece of valley floor for 21 years, and had the particular stubbornness of a man who'd survived by being right about the land for so long that he'd forgotten it was possible to be wrong. "They tell me you know something about the water," he said. She'd been up on the terrace when Eli brought her the news he was there. She came down and stood in front of Roy Dunmore and waited. "I've been watching the water table since March," she said. "Yes." "2 wells," he said. "I drilled 2 wells and they both went dry." "You drilled both of them into the same aquifer," she said. "The main table's dropping. It doesn't matter how many holes you put in the same layer." He looked at her. She could see the resistance, the deep, lifelong resistance of a man being told something essential and unwanted by a person his every instinct told him not to take seriously. She waited. "What do I do?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. It was more like something escaping from him against his will. "Come to the meeting on the 15th, she said, "and don't drill any more wells until we talk about where to put them." He nodded, slow, like a man moving underwater. "My wife's asking where we get water for the stock," he said, "through the winter." "How many head?" 34. She did the calculation. "I can let you draw from my cistern for the next 6 weeks, she said. 2 trips a week, 40 gallons each trip. But you bring the containers and you do the hauling." He stared at her. "You'd do that?" he said. "I'd do that," she said. "On the condition that you come to the meeting and you listen with an open mind." He put his hat back on. His jaw was doing something complicated. "I said things about you," he said. "When you bought the cliff, I said you were a fool. A lot of people said that," she said. He stopped. "I'm telling you, I was wrong." "I know," she said. "Come to the meeting." The second thing that happened was that one of Carter's hands, a young man named Dale Phipps, rode up the switchback road without Carter's knowledge and without announcing himself, and spent 20 minutes walking around the cliff property, looking at the terraces and the cistern and the seedling shelter, before Clara came around the corner of the cliff face and found him there. He was maybe 22, with the look of someone who'd been sent to observe and report, but had gotten more interested in the observing than the reporting. "You're not supposed to be up here," she said. He startled, turned, had the grace to look embarrassed. "No, ma'am, I'm sorry, He looked around. "I've been trying to figure out how you did this." She looked at him. He was holding his hat, and his expression was genuinely curious, not calculating, not mocking. Just a young man trying to understand something. "What specifically?" she said. "The terrace walls," he said. "My family has land up near the North Ridge. It's not valley floor, it's angled, and we always figured there was no point trying to farm it. But looking at this," he gestured at her stone terraces. "This is angled land. You turned it into something." Clara studied him. "Who are you, Dale Phipps?" "I work Carter's South operation." "You're here without his knowledge?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He thought about that. "Because I've got a mother and 2 sisters on that North Ridge land, and the valley wells are starting to go, and I need to know how to help them." Something settled in Clara's chest. This was the real thing, not Carter's strategic repositioning or Dunmore's crisis desperation, but a young man with family on uncertain ground, trying to learn before the worst arrived. "Come back Saturday," she said. "Bring your measurements of the ridgeland. Great aspect what the soil does when it rains." She paused. "And bring your mother if she's willing. What she knows about that piece of ground is more useful than what you think you know about it." He blinked. "My mother." "The person who's been farming a piece of land for decades knows that land," she said. "That knowledge is worth more than any book, including my grandfather's." Dale Phipps looked at her for a moment, with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who has had something they'd half known, confirmed by someone they didn't expect to say it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Saturday." He rode back down the switchback road. Eli appeared behind her. "How many people are we going to have up here before this is over?" "As many as need to come," Clara said. The third thing that happened in January's first 2 weeks was Ethan Walker. He came on a Wednesday, which was unusual. He'd settled into Tuesdays and Thursdays, regular as weather, and he came later in the day than normal, which was also unusual. And when he rode up the switchback, his face had something on it she hadn't seen there before. She waited until he'd dismounted. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing happened," he said. "Ethan." He looked at her. He had the particular stillness of a man who has been rehearsing something and has decided in the moment to abandon the rehearsal. "I talked to Bob Channing at the land office today," he said, "about the Millard Creek property." She waited. "There's a parcel adjacent to mine that's coming available, 20 acres on the creek." He stopped. It would make the smithy operation more stable. Better access to water for the forge work, more room for materials. He looked at the ground and then back at her. "And it's a good piece of land." She studied him. "That's good news." "I think it might be," he said. "I'm going to look at it Friday." He paused. "I wanted to know if you'd come with me." The air between them was very still. "To look at the land," she said. "Yes," he said. Then, "And yes, to look at the land. And I'd like your opinion of it. Your assessment. You read land better than anyone I've ever met, and I trust your judgment, and—" He stopped, exhaled. "And I'd like to spend a day doing something that isn't crisis management, with someone whose company I with you." Clara looked at him. She thought about James. She thought about the cliff and the terraces and the cistern and everything she'd built by herself in 5 months out of grief and knowledge and sheer refusal to be what everyone expected her to be. She thought about what Eli had said. He sees you, not just the project, and about whether she was ready for that to be as true as it felt like it was. She thought about the land office meeting on the 15th. She thought about Dunmore's face when he'd asked what he should do. She thought about Dale Phipps riding back down to his mother on the North Ridge. She thought about all the weight of the valley that had been settling onto her shoulders since November. The weight of knowing and the obligation that came with knowing, and the strange loneliness of carrying that weight in a place that had spent 6 months deciding she wasn't worth paying attention to. She thought about Ethan Walker, who had shown up on a Thursday in September and asked what kind of chisel she was using and looked at the cliff. The way people look at something they genuinely want to understand, and who had not once in 4 months said a single word about her size, or her age, or her status as a widow, or any of the other categories that the rest of Red Hollow had filed her under and called it knowledge. "Friday," she said. Something crossed his face. Relief, she thought, and something quieter underneath the relief. "Friday," he said. He stayed another 2 hours, and they worked on the upper catchment channel together in the long, cold afternoon light, and they didn't talk about Friday again, and they didn't need to. That night she lay on her bedroll in the cliff shelter and looked at the stone ceiling and listened to Eli breathing and thought about the January 15th meeting. She thought about all the landowners who would file into whatever room Carter chose the mill. Probably it was the largest covered space in Red Hollow, and look at her and run through the same calculation they always ran and arrive at the same verdict they always arrived at. And she thought about what she was going to say when they did. She was not a woman who needed approval. She'd established that to her own satisfaction in the 6 months since James died. But she was beginning to understand a woman who needed to be useful. And useful was different from approved of. It was harder and more specific and more honest. Approved of meant they liked what they saw when they looked at her. Useful meant the thing she knew and the thing they needed were the same thing, and that the gap between those two facts was something she could bridge if she was smart about it and patient about it and willing to do the thing no one expected her to do. She was all of those things. She had been preparing to be all of those things for a long time. The meeting was in 12 days. She closed her eyes and started from the beginning of her presentation and ran through it until she fell asleep with the numbers still moving in her head, certain and real and entirely hers. The 15th of January came in gray and still the kind of cold that didn't move, didn't bite, just settled over everything like a second skin. Clara rode into Red Hollow before 7 in the morning. She wanted to be there before the others arrived. She wanted to set her materials on the table and stand in the room while it was empty and feel the dimensions of it, not because she was nervous exactly, but because she'd learned that preparation was the only honest antidote to the particular vulnerability of being a woman who walked into a room full of men who hadn't decided yet whether to listen to her. Carter had chosen the mill's main floor. She'd expected that. It was the largest covered space in Red Hollow, with enough room for 30 men to stand without crowding. He'd had someone bring in chairs and a long table, and when Clara walked in through the side door, she found him there already adjusting the chairs with the focused attention of a man who was using small physical tasks to manage something larger. He looked up when he heard her. "You're early," he said. "So are you," she said. He straightened. "I've been thinking about what you said. The mechanism, the upstream diversion." He paused. "I stopped it 2 days ago." She hadn't known that. She held still for a moment and processed it, not the decision itself, which she'd expected eventually, but the timing. He'd done it before the meeting, before he had any social cover for it, before he could point to a room full of landowners who'd agreed it was necessary. He'd done it because he believed her. "That took something," she said. "It took deciding which kind of wrong I wanted to be," he said. "The kind that keeps going, or the kind that stops." He moved one more chair and then looked at her directly. "I've been the wrong kind for a while with you. I'd like to start being the other kind." She set her notebooks on the table. "Then let's make sure today counts," she said. They came in, starting at 8 ranchers and farmers and mill hands, and 2 men from the county land office, who Carter had invited, she assumed, to provide some form of institutional weight to whatever was going to happen. They came in the way men come into rooms where something important is about to occur, with that particular combination of wariness and performance, each one checking who else was there before deciding where to stand. Clara watched them come in, and watched them see her, and watched the calculation happen behind their eyes, fast as a blink. She knew the sequence by now. She'd seen it enough times to name every step. First, the size of her, the round face, the heavy figure, the way she took up space in a way women were generally expected not to. Then, the age, visibly young, which in a room full of men over 40, translated directly to the question of why she was there. Then the widow status, which they all knew, which put her in the category of women who needed managing. Then the cliff, which some of them had ridden out to look at in the past months, and all of them had heard about, which didn't resolve the calculation but complicated it. Most of them landed finally on a kind of uncertain attention, not respect, not dismissal, something in between that was waiting to be resolved. Roy Dunmore came in and nodded at her and took a seat in the second row, which was its own kind of statement. Dale Phipps came in behind him, and behind Dale came a woman in her late 50s with Dale's same jaw and Dale's same direct eyes, and Clara understood immediately that this was Dale's mother. Eleanor Phipps, who had apparently decided to attend without anyone formally inviting her, and had apparently decided that the room was going to accommodate that fact. Clara caught Eleanor's eye and nodded. Eleanor nodded back. By 8:30 there were 26 people in the room. Carter called the meeting to order. "Most of you know why we're here," he said. 2 wells failed in the valley in the past 6 weeks. I shut down the South Pasture diversion 2 days ago. I did that because I was shown evidence that the valley's water table is under stress that is going to get significantly worse before it gets better. He paused. "The person who showed me that evidence is Clara Whitmore. I've asked her to present what she knows." The room shifted. Not dramatically, nobody walked out or said anything out loud, but the quality of the attention changed. She could feel it like a change in air pressure. She stood up. She had her grandfather's journals arranged in order at the left side of the table, and her own notebook open to the rainfall calculations and a map she'd drawn of the valley's water table from her grandfather's original surveys, updated with current data. She didn't begin with an apology for being there. She'd considered it the instinct to soften her presence to acknowledge the room's discomfort with her before she made any demands on its attention, and she'd decided against it because an apology at the beginning of a presentation is an invitation to dismiss what follows. She began with the creek, The Red Hollow Creek measured 14 inches lower at the main ford in December than the average December level recorded in my grandfather's surveys over a 20-year period, she said. 2 wells in the valley have failed since November. A 3rd well on the Haynes property went dry yesterday morning. The room went still. A man in the back said, 3 boy. Garrett Haynes' 2nd well, she said. The one he drilled in October when the first one failed, dry as of yesterday. The murmur that moved through the room was low and controlled the sound of men who are used to managing their reactions in public but who have just heard something that makes management difficult. She let the murmur settle. Then she put the map on the table and explained the valley's water table in the same terms her grandfather had used aquifer layers, recharge rates, drawdown patterns, but in plain language, translated from the technical into the practical, because the point was not to demonstrate her knowledge, but to transfer it. For 8 minutes, the room was quiet, in a way rooms almost never are. Real quiet. The kind that means people are actually thinking, rather than waiting for a pause to disagree. Then a man named Bert Coulter, who ran the largest dry goods operation south of Carter's Land, raised his hand. "Where'd you get this information?" he said. Not hostile exactly, but with the undertone of a man who needs the source before he can trust the content. "My grandfather, Thomas Pruitt, surveyed this valley's water systems from 1851 to 1871, she said. 6 journals of observations, measurements, and analysis. I've been updating his records with current measurements since March of last year." She paused. "My grandfather was a meticulous man. His measurements on the East Creek tributary were within half an inch of what a county survey confirmed in 1872. If you want to verify his methodology, the original journals are on this table." Coulter looked at the journals. He didn't reach for them, not yet. "And your conclusion," he said. 6 to 8 additional wells will fail before July, she said. Creek levels will drop below viable mill operation by May. If planting decisions don't change before April, the valley's crop yield will be insufficient to sustain its population through winter 1885. The room broke open. Not in panic. These were not men who panicked, but in the particular explosive energy of a crowd of people who have just been told something catastrophic and have approximately 30 seconds before they have to decide whether to believe it. 3 men talked at once. Carter raised his hand, and they stopped because Carter could do that. "Let her finish," Carter said. She finished. The questions after were hard and specific, and she was glad they were because hard, specific questions meant engagement, and engagement meant the information was landing. Coulter asked about the methodology. A farmer named Henderson asked about crop alternatives. Roy Dunmore asked about the aquifer depth on the north side of the valley in a way that revealed he'd been thinking about this since their conversation at the cliff. And then a man named Gerald Walsh, who had a property on the west side of the valley and who had been sitting in the far back corner with his arms crossed since he came in, said, "I don't see why we should be taking water advice from a young woman who bought a cliff nobody else wanted." The room went quiet in a different way. Clara looked at Walsh. He was maybe 60, with the expression of a man who'd decided his life experience entitled him to be the defining authority in any room he walked into. She'd been expecting something like this. Not from Walsh specifically, but from someone. There was always someone. "Mr. Walsh," she said, "you're welcome to evaluate my methodology rather than my biography. The journals are on the table. The measurements are in the notebook. The map is in front of you." She held his gaze steadily. "If you find an error in the data, I want to know about it. If you don't find an error, I'd suggest the source is less important than the information." Walsh opened his mouth. Eleanor Phipps from the second row said, "Gerald, my son rode up to that cliff and came home and told me more useful things about managing angled land in a drought than I'd learned in 20 years of trying. So maybe close your mouth and open one of those journals." The room did something unusual then. It laughed. Not cruelly, genuinely, the laugh of people released from a tension that had been building. Even Walsh, after a moment, let his arms drop from his crossed position, which was as close to conceding a point as Clara suspected Gerald Walsh ever got. Carter stepped in. "The question before us is not who's talking," he said. "It's what we're going to do." And that was the moment the meeting shifted from resistance to work. They were there for 3 more hours. Clara had not expected 3 hours. She'd prepared for 90 minutes and had thought that was optimistic. But the questions kept coming, and they kept being real questions, not rhetorical, not challenges dressed as questions, but men and one woman genuinely trying to understand what they were facing and what they could do about it. She taught them about water conservation the way her grandfather had taught her without knowing he was teaching her through the logic of it, through the mechanism so that they understood not just what to do, but why it worked. She showed them the terrace drainage system and explained how the principle could be applied to valley floor farming. She walked through crop selection for reduced water cultivation. She explained how to read a well for early signs of aquifer stress so they could catch problems before they became failures. Carter took notes. That more than anything told her the room had shifted. William Carter, who owned more land than anyone in the county and had more experience than most people in the room combined, was sitting at the table with a pencil writing down what she said. The meeting ended with 7 specific commitments, all of which Carter documented, and all of which had names attached to them. Dunmore committed to halting further drilling until the aquifer survey Clara recommended could be completed. Henderson committed to converting his east field to drought-tolerant grain. Dale Phipps, speaking quietly, but clearly committed to building a catchment system on the North Ridge property following Clara's design, and Eleanor Phipps said she'd come to the cliff the following Saturday to walk through it in person. Walsh didn't commit to anything, but he took one of the notebooks before he left. Carter walked her out when it was over through the empty mill floor, and they stood for a moment in the doorway. "That was well done," he said. "It's a start," she said. "They'll need more than one meeting." "I know, but they're listening now." She paused. "That's more than I had in October." He nodded. He looked like a man who was still processing several things at once. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to do something to help, materially, not charity." He said it quickly because he could see the thing that moved across her face, a resource exchange. "You have knowledge this valley needs. I have materials, labor access to supply lines. I want to propose an arrangement." She looked at him. "What kind of arrangement?" "I fund the materials for an expanded cistern on your cliff property. The labor is mine. I have men who aren't doing much right now with the pasture irrigation shut down. In exchange, you consult on water management for Carter operations, and you run training sessions for whoever in this valley wants to learn what you know." He paused. "And I'd like to commission a full survey of the valley water table using your grandfather's methodology and your current data. Something the county can use going forward." She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, because something was moving in her chest that she needed a moment to get composed around, not sentiment, not exactly, but the particular feeling of a long effort arriving somewhere real. "The cistern expansion changes my capacity significantly," she said. "I could hold enough water to serve as an emergency supply for the whole valley through a dry season." "That's the idea," he said, "and the survey gives the county documentation that survives past this drought." "And past both of us," he said. She thought about her grandfather in his cabin with his journals, 20 years of careful observation that the world had mostly ignored because it didn't arrive in the right wrapper from the right person. She thought about the satisfaction he'd written about in the final journal. Not the satisfaction of being believed, but of having written it down well enough that it might be believed later by whoever found it. She'd found it. "Agreed," she said. She rode back to the cliff in the afternoon and found Ethan already there, working on the upper catchment channel he'd come to finish that day. He looked up when she rode in, and something in her face told him what he needed to know before she said a word. "It went well," he said. "It went very well," she said. She dismounted and tied the horse and stood there for a moment with her hand on the horse's neck, feeling the January cold on her face, and the particular clarity that comes after a large thing has gone the way you needed it to go. Carter wants to fund the cistern expansion. Ethan set down his tool. That's big, she said. Yes, he wants a full valley water survey. He wants training sessions. She paused. He wants to use what I know. Ethan looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read. Still learning to let herself read, which was a different and harder thing. What do you want? He said. I want to be useful enough that when this drought is over, the valley has changed how it thinks about water permanently, she said. Not just survived, changed. That's a larger ambition than surviving a drought. I've never been interested in just surviving, she said. James used to say I thought too big. She stopped. He meant it as a compliment, I think. Most of the time. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, my father said the only problems worth solving are the ones that stay solved. She looked at him. Your father and my grandfather would have had a lot to talk about. Probably would have argued the whole time, he said. Probably, she said, and she was smiling and she let herself. February arrived and with it the cistern work. Carter sent 4 men up the switchback road on a Monday with a wagon load of stone and mortar and the particular organized energy of people who've been given a project that matters. Clara had drawn the expansion plans herself, based on her grandfather's original cistern sketches, modified for current capacity needs. She wanted to triple the storage volume, which required deepening the east wall and extending the south face by 8 feet. She worked alongside Carter's men without ceremony. That surprised them. She could tell they'd expected to be handed instructions and left to it, and instead they got Clara in work clothes with a level and a copy of the plans walking the site and explaining what she needed with the directness of someone who'd built the original and understood every decision that had gone into it. The man Carter had sent to lead the crew was named Frank Oates, mid-40s, solid, and experienced with the weathered look of someone who'd built things outdoors for 30 years. He'd given her a look when she'd first appeared with the plans, not hostile, but assessing, and she'd handed him the drawings and waited. He'd looked at the plans for a long time. These are good, he said, which was clearly the most he was prepared to say about them. They need to work, she said. Not just look good. He almost smiled. I know the difference. Then we'll get along, she said. They did. By the end of the first week, Frank Oates addressed her as Miss Clara, without the assessing look, and by the end of the second week, he'd started bringing her problems, rather than making decisions without her, which was the real signal of professional respect among builders. Eli watched this with the quiet delight of a younger brother who is seeing the world arrange itself correctly. Frank Oates told someone in town you were the sharpest engineer he'd worked with, Eli said one evening. He said designer, Clara said, not engineer. He said engineer, Eli said. I was there. He said it to Roy Dunmore. She said nothing, but she carried the word for the rest of the day like something warm in her coat pocket. The Friday land visit with Ethan happened in late February, delayed from January by the weather and the cistern work, and it was not what she'd expected, which was its own kind of revelation. She'd expected to spend the day doing what she did, reading the land, assessing the water, thinking about drainage and soil, and the mathematics of sustainable cultivation. And she did those things. But the Millard Creek parcel turned out to be 20 acres of varied terrain with a running spring she hadn't expected, and a stand of mature cottonwood that told its own story about water consistency. And somewhere in the middle of her third circuit of the property, she realized she had stopped thinking about the land as a professional problem and started experiencing it the way she'd experienced the cliff before she'd owned it. As possibility, as potential, as the particular pleasure of a mind encountering something it wants to understand. Ethan walked beside her for most of it without saying much, which she was learning was characteristic. He'd grown up in the kind of family where silence was a form of respect, where you didn't fill the air with words just to fill it. He asked questions when he had them, and they were always the right questions, the kind that opened things up rather than closing them down. Late in the afternoon, when they'd covered most of the parcel, and she'd taken her measurements, and he'd asked what she thought about the spring's reliability. And she'd told him honestly that it looked better than she'd expected, and explained why they stopped at the edge of the creek and stood for a moment in the thin February sun. "You should buy it," she said. "That's your professional assessment." "That's my honest assessment. The spring is consistent. The soil's deeper than it looks on the north end. The cottonwoods tell you the water's been reliable here for at least 20 years. It's a good piece of ground." He was looking at the creek. "What would you do with it if it were yours?" She looked at the land and let herself think about it. The cottonwoods, the spring, the angled north end that reminded her slightly of the cliff's shelf. "I'd leave the cottonwoods alone," she said. "They're holding the bank. I'd put a mill on the south end, take advantage of the creek drop there. I'd plant the north end in stages, let it tell you what it wants before you decide what to put in it." She paused. "And I'd build something near the spring. Not a mill. Something you'd want to come back to." He turned and looked at her. She looked back. "Something you'd want to come back to," he repeated quietly. The air between them had changed. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them rushed it. "I meant a house," she said. "I know what you meant," he said. She held his gaze, and he held hers. And the creek ran past them cold and clear, and she thought about what she'd told Eli so far. "Yes, I trust him." And about how far was farther now than it had been in September, and getting farther still. "Ethan," she said. "Clara," he said. His voice was careful and real, and nothing like the voice of a man performing something. "I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not in a position where I need someone. I want you to understand that. I've built something on that cliff, and I know what I'm capable of, and I'm not looking for someone to fill a space that James left." "I know that," he said. "I've watched you for 5 months. I know exactly what you're capable of." "Then what?" she said and stopped. "I want to be someone you choose," he said. "Not someone you need, someone you look at and think yes. That one, on purpose." He looked at the creek. "I've been waiting to find someone worth choosing on purpose. I'm telling you that I think you might be that person." He paused. "I'm not in a hurry. I know you have a valley to save before you have time for anything else. He exhaled. "I wanted you to know." Clara was quiet for a long time. She thought about what courage looked like. She'd thought about it in terms of the cliff and the well and the January meeting. The courage of doing the thing nobody expected you to do, of being right in front of people who were certain you were wrong. But this was a different kind. This was the courage of standing in front of someone who had seen you clearly and saying, "I see you too," without knowing yet what came next. "I don't want to be in a hurry either," she said. "But I think yes, that one." She said it quietly. On purpose. He didn't reach for her hand or step toward her, and she appreciated that the same economy of motion he brought to everything, the understanding that some moments don't need to be made larger than they are. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. They rode back to Red Hollow in the late afternoon with the valley spread out below them brown and winter dry and still, and she looked at the creek as they crossed it and made her note about the water level, because some habits were permanent, and then she looked at the cliff in the distance and thought about what was coming. March arrived, and with it, Eleanor Phipps. Eleanor came on the first Saturday of the month as she'd promised, and she came alone without Dale, which Clara had not expected. She was a compact woman with efficient movements, and the look of someone who'd made peace with hard work so long ago she'd stopped thinking of it as a category. She walked the cliff property with Clara for 2 hours, looking at everything, asking direct questions that revealed 20 years of practical knowledge about the land she farmed. She understood soil behavior and drainage patterns in ways that came from long observation rather than from books, and more than once she said something that Clara wrote down because it was information she didn't have. At the end of the walk, Eleanor stood at the top of the finished terrace and looked out over the valley. "My husband thought we were stuck with the North Ridge," she said. "He said the land was what it was, and you worked with it or you didn't, but you didn't change it." "What do you think?" Clara said. I think he was right about most things, Eleanor said. But I think he'd never met someone who'd changed a cliff into a farm. She looked at Clara directly. I want to learn everything you can teach me. Come Saturdays, Clara said. Bring Dale. Between your knowledge of the ridge and my knowledge of the system, we'll figure out what works. Eleanor nodded. Then she said without preamble, I also want to say something about the way this town has treated you. Clara waited. It's not been right, Eleanor said. The talk and the looks and the way people decided what you were before they'd spent 10 minutes with you. I was part of that too. I didn't say anything out loud, but I didn't say anything against it either, and that's the same thing. She paused. I'm sorry for it. Clara looked at this woman who'd gotten up early on a Saturday and ridden 3 miles to a cliff property to learn how to save her family's land. And she thought about the difference between apologies that were meant to relieve the person giving them and apologies that were meant to be received by the person they were owed to. Eleanor's apology was the second kind. I appreciate that, Clara said, genuinely. You're doing something good here, Eleanor said. Not just the technical thing, the teaching, the willingness to share it. There are people who'd take what you know and use it as leverage. You're not doing that. I thought about it, Clara said honestly. When it was bad in the fall, I thought about they could come to me and I could decide what they got. Eleanor nodded. What changed your mind? My grandfather, Clara said. He spent 20 years recording everything he knew about this valley, and he never tried to use it as leverage because he understood that knowledge that isn't shared stops being knowledge and starts being just a possession. She paused. He died without very many people knowing what he'd learned. I don't want to do that. Eleanor was quiet. Your grandfather sounds like he was a remarkable man, she said. He was, Clara said. I never met him. The silence that followed was the kind that needed no filling. April arrived, and with it the first real sign that Clara's worst projections were right, and her most optimistic ones were wrong. Henderson's well dropped 6 inches in a week. The Coulter property's secondary well ran dry without warning on a Tuesday, and Bert Coulter rode to the cliff that afternoon, still dusty from the road, which was an action so contrary to his natural dignity that it communicated urgency better than anything he could have said. The east well, he said when she came out to meet him. Gone. When? This morning. It was low yesterday, but I thought... He stopped. I thought it would stabilize. They don't stabilize, she said. When they start dropping that fast, they go. She was already doing the calculation in her head. Coulter's property east side, that aquifer, if that layer was failing, then the pressure on the main table was worse than her February estimate. How many head of stock do you have? 60 cattle, a dozen horses. The cistern's expanded now, she said. I can take some of the stock load. But Bert, she used his first name without thinking about it, and he didn't flinch. You need to start having a conversation with your neighbors about shared water management. The east side properties are going to feel this first. You can do it in crisis, or you can do it now. He looked at her. He was a proud man. She'd understood that from the dry goods store, the way he stood behind his counter with the particular authority of a man whose business was also his identity. She watched him do the calculation between pride and necessity, and she watched necessity win. What do I say to them? He said. Tell them the truth, she said. Tell them Bert Coulter's well ran dry, and he went to the woman on the cliff, and she told him it was going to happen to them too. Tell them she's offering to help before it does. They'll come, he said. Yes, she said. They'll come. He rode back down the switchback road, and she stood watching him go. And then she went inside and opened her notebook to the page where she'd been tracking the projected failure sequence. She'd been right about the order. She'd been right about the timing. She'd been right about almost everything she'd tried to tell this valley for 6 months, and the strange weight of being right about bad things was something she hadn't quite prepared for. The way it didn't feel like triumph at all, only like responsibility. Only like the understanding that every projection that came true was a family somewhere having a conversation about water they didn't have enough of. Eli came in and found her at the table. More, he said. Coulter's East well, she said. He sat down across from her. He'd changed in the months on the cliff in ways she'd been watching without comment. He was broader through the shoulders, steadier in his manner, less given to the reactive anxiety she'd first seen in him when she'd put the deed on the land office counter. He was 16, and he was becoming someone serious. What do you need from me? He said. Not what happens next. Not, are you okay? What do you need? She looked at her brother. I need you to start handling the Saturday training sessions, she said. Eleanor and Dale and whoever else comes. You know the terrace system as well as I do now, and you understand the catchment mechanics. I need to spend more time on the survey work Carter commissioned. Me, he said. Run the sessions. You, she said. You're good at explaining things in a way people can hear. You don't make them feel stupid for not knowing. He was quiet for a moment. Did you used to make people feel stupid? I used to be less careful about it, she said. He almost smiled. Ethan said you've gotten better. Ethan said what? He said you've gotten his exact words, where you've gotten better at letting people arrive at the understanding themselves instead of just putting it in front of them and waiting for them to accept it. Eli paused. He said it like it was a compliment. When did he say this to you? Last Tuesday, while you were up on the North Channel. Eli kept his expression carefully neutral. We talk sometimes, me and Ethan. About me, she said. About things. Eli cleared his throat in a way that was entirely unconvincing. Water systems. Chisel technique. Eli. He genuinely cares about you, Clara, Eli said, dropping the performance. I know you know that. I wanted to say it, because you spent a lot of time after James thinking that nobody would look at you and actually see you. And I think someone does. She looked at her brother. This boy who'd climbed a cliff with her when he had every reason not to, who'd learned to move stone and read soil and handle a well auger, who'd stood beside her in every difficult thing for 6 months without complaint or drama. Only steady help and occasional aggravating insight. Someone does, she said. Good, he said. He stood up. I'll take the Saturday sessions, but you have to let me do them my way. Your way. Eleanor told me I explain things clearly. I don't want you standing over my shoulder correcting my technique. She looked at him. Eleanor told you that? First Saturday she came. She said, Eli straightened slightly. She said I had a teacher's manner, which is apparently a good thing. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, don't let it go to your head. He grinned. No, ma'am. That evening, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara sat down at the table without a notebook in front of her. She sat with her hands around a cup of cooling coffee and looked at the cliff wall and thought about Roy Dunmore's face when he'd asked what to do, and Bert Coulter writing in Dusty and Proud and asking the same question a different way, and Eleanor Phipps saying she was sorry with the weight of someone who meant it, and Carter writing down what she said with his own pencil at his own table. She thought about Walsh taking the notebook. She thought about Ethan on purpose. She thought about her grandfather in his cabin, writing in his small, careful hand about a valley he loved that didn't know he was paying attention. She thought about a 19-year-old widow who had put a deed against her chest and walked out of a land office into the Colorado heat while the laughter followed her down the boardwalk, and she tried to find pity for that woman and couldn't because that woman had known exactly what she was doing and exactly why, and the only thing she'd gotten wrong was the timeline. The creek was dropping. The valley was waking up. And Clara. Whitmore too. Young, too heavy, too strange, too quiet. Too much of everything. The wrong people had decided was too much. Sat in the cliff shelter she had built with her own hands and felt the particular durable satisfaction of a person who has been preparing for a long time for exactly this. May came in like a held breath. Finally released, except what came out wasn't relief. It was heat. The kind of heat that arrived 3 weeks early and didn't apologize for it. Clara felt it the first morning of the month when she woke before dawn, and the air was already wrong thick and still and carrying the particular dry edge that her grandfather had described in the journals as The silence before the land starts begging. She'd read that line a dozen times over the years and thought she understood it. She understood it now in her body in a way she hadn't before. She was up and moving before Eli stirred checking the cistern level, the way she checked it every morning. The expanded cistern held 320 gallons at full capacity, and it was currently at 284, which was good, which was better than she'd projected for this date. But the number that occupied her mind as she stood there in the early dark wasn't the cistern. It was the creek. She'd ridden out to the ford the previous Thursday and measured, down 22 inches from the September mark. 22 inches in 8 months. Her grandfather's most severe recorded drought had dropped the creek 19 inches over a full calendar year. They were moving faster than the worst thing she had data for. She went inside and made coffee and opened her notebook to the page she'd been building since February. The running tally of every well failure, every creek measurement, every conversation with every farmer and rancher who'd brought her their numbers. The tally had 43 entries now. 7 failed wells. Creek at historic low. 3 properties on the east side reporting crop failures on their winter plantings before the summer heat had even arrived. She was looking at this page when Carter rode up the switchback road at 6 in the morning, which had never happened before. Carter did not ride to people's properties at 6 in the morning. Carter sent word and arranged meetings, and arrived at agreed-upon times. The fact that he was here now unannounced at dawn told her everything she needed to know before he'd said a single word. He dismounted, and she came out to meet him, and she could see in the set of his face that he'd been awake most of the night. "The mill wheel stopped this morning," he said. "Creek's too low to turn it." She had been expecting this. She'd told him in February it would happen by May. But expecting a thing and hearing it confirmed are different, and she watched something move through Carter's expression that she recognized as the particular grief of a man watching something he'd built stop working. "The mill's been running for 18 years, he said, not to her specifically. "My father built the wheel. It's never stopped, not for weather." "Carter," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I know what that is. I'm sorry." He nodded. Something in his jaw worked. Then he straightened. "What do we do?" "We call a second meeting," she said, "this week, and this time we talk about emergency measures rather than preventive ones because we're past the preventive window." She paused. "I need you to be honest with people about the mill. They need to understand that this isn't a bad season. This is the crisis I've been describing since January. You think they still need convincing." "I think Gerald Walsh still hasn't come to talk to me," she said. "And I think there are people on the west side of the valley who've been hoping it would rain and solve the problem. I think a stopped mill wheel is the kind of evidence that ends hope and starts action." Carter was quiet. "Walsh came to see me last week," he said. She stilled. "About what?" "About you." Carter looked at her directly. "He's been going around saying the January meeting was, he called it, a performance. He said you manipulated the data to make the situation look worse than it is. He said you're building yourself up as the valley's savior so you can leverage it into something." The words landed with a specific weight. She'd expected skepticism. She'd expected the usual resistance that attached itself to her regardless of what she did or said. But manipulation, deliberate falsification, that was different. That was the kind of accusation that once it was in the air attached itself to a person's name, whether it was true or not. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him I'd watched the mill wheel stop," Carter said, "and that the woman who predicted it 6 months ago wasn't manipulating anything. And he said a stopped wheel could have other causes." Carter paused. "He's going around to the West Side landowners. I don't know how many he's gotten to." Clara looked at her notebook. The 43 entries, the 7 failed wells, the measurements she'd taken every week for 8 months with the same pocket knife, the same stone, the same careful handwriting her grandfather had passed down to her without knowing he was passing it down. "Who does Walsh owe money to?" she said. Carter's eyes sharpened. "Why?" Because that kind of resistance isn't usually philosophical, she said. People who fight evidence this hard usually have a reason that isn't about the evidence. She paused. He hasn't drilled a new well. He hasn't changed his planting. He hasn't done a single thing the January meeting recommended. And now he's actively working against the information. She looked at Carter. Something's in the way. What is it? Carter was quiet for a long time. Walsh has a deal with a water speculator out of Denver, he said finally. Man named Holcomb, Theodore Holcomb. Walsh brought him in 2 years ago. Holcomb sank capital into a series of deep wells on Walsh's western land in exchange for water rights on the profits. The arrangement only makes sense if the valley needs water Walsh controls. Clara stared at him. A drought, she said slowly. That Walsh doesn't prepare for, that the valley doesn't prepare for, is the moment Holcomb's investment pays out. Because everyone else's wells are dry, and Walsh has the deep drilled supply, Carter said, and Holcomb owns the rights to sell it. The understanding settled through her like cold water. Walsh isn't trying to protect his pride, she said. He's protecting a financial scheme that depends on this valley being desperate. That's my conclusion, Carter said. I've been trying to verify it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, she said. Carter. I needed to be certain before I said it to you, he said. You've been right about everything. I wasn't going to bring you something I wasn't certain of. She paced 3 steps and came back. How many people has he gotten to? West Side landowners mostly. Maybe 6 or 8 families. Enough that if they don't conserve through the summer, their wells fail, and they go to Holcomb. He paused. Holcomb's already in town. He came in last week. Quiet, setting up. We need to move fast, she said. Yes, Carter said. The meeting. Can you call it for Saturday? I can call it for Thursday, he said. If you're ready. I've been ready since January, she said. She had 2 days. She spent the first of them riding the West Side properties herself. Not all of them, but the 3 she judged most critical based on their aquifer position and their distance from the creek. She arrived at each place unannounced and asked to speak to whoever was home, and explained in the plainest language she had what she knew about the water table and what she suspected about Holcomb's arrangement and what the choice before them actually was. At the first property, a farm run by a man named Samuel Greer and his wife, she was made to wait on the porch for 15 minutes before Samuel came out with the expression of a man who'd already been told she was coming and had already been told what to think about it. Walsh says you've been exaggerating the situation, Samuel said. Walsh has a financial interest in you not preparing, Clara said. He blinked. She watched him process the directness of it. She hadn't softened. It hadn't built up to it, had just put it in his hand flat and let him feel the shape of it. What do you mean? He said. She told him. Not everything. She didn't have everything confirmed, but enough. The Denver speculator, the deep wells, the water rights arrangement. The way a valley that went into crisis unprepared was the exact condition that arrangement required. Samuel Greer stood on his porch and listened, and when she finished, he stood there for a long time. You're saying Walsh is deliberately. I'm saying Walsh has made choices that make sense if you assume he benefits from this valley being in crisis, she said. I'm not saying he caused the drought. The drought is real, and it was coming regardless. I'm saying he's positioned himself to profit from it instead of helping his neighbors survive it. That's a serious thing to say about a man. Yes, she said. It is. Can you prove it? Not completely, she said. Not yet. But I can show you 8 months of water data that proves the crisis is real, and I can show you that every property that followed the January meeting's recommendations is in significantly better shape than every property that didn't. She paused. You can decide for yourself what that means about why someone would argue against the recommendations. She rode away from the Greer property, not knowing which way Samuel had landed, and she went to the second property, and then the third, and she said the same things in slightly different language each time, adjusting for what she could read in each face. And when she rode back to the cliff that evening, she was tired, in the way that comes from sustained concentration rather than physical effort. Eli had supper ready, which he'd taken to doing without comment since April, and she ate without tasting much of it and told him about Walsh and Holcomb. Eli put his fork down. "He's using the drought," Eli said. "He knew it was coming. He knew because you told people in January and he didn't prepare. He let it happen." "He positioned to benefit from it," she said. "That's different from causing it, but not by as much as Walsh would probably like." "What happens at the Thursday meeting? I present the data," she said. "Carter backs it up, and we see whether the truth is enough or whether Walsh has gotten to too many people. And if he has, then we deal with what's left," she said. "We protect what we can." Eli picked his fork back up. He ate 2 bites. Then, "Ethan knows something." She looked up. "He came by today while you were out," Eli said carefully. "He knows something about Holcomb. He said he'd come Thursday morning before the meeting." She set her own fork down. "Did he say what?" "No, but he looked, you know how Ethan looks when he's thought something through completely and is waiting for the right moment. He looked like that." She knew exactly how Ethan looked like that. "Thursday morning," she said. Ethan arrived before 6 on Thursday with the focused expression of a man who had not slept well and had used the sleeplessness productively. He dismounted and came inside without ceremony and put a folded document on the table in front of her. "Holcomb filed water rights claims with the county," he said. "6 weeks ago. Bob Channing at the land office is a friend of mine. I asked him to look at the filing." He paused. "The claims cover Walsh's deep wells and 12 additional well sites on 4 neighboring properties." Clara unfolded the document. "He filed claims on properties he doesn't own," she said. "He filed claims on wells that don't exist yet," Ethan said. "Speculative claims. He's planning to drill them on land where the owners don't know their water rights are being claimed." She looked at the filing. The names of the properties were there in plain ink. 2 of them were properties she'd visited 2 days ago. Samuel Greer's name was on the list. "He was planning this before the drought got bad," she said. "These claims are 6 weeks old. This wasn't a response to the crisis. This was the plan." "Walsh knew," Ethan said. "Walsh brought Holcomb in. The drought was just the timing." Clara sat for a moment with the document in her hands and felt the particular cold clarity that comes when something you suspected turns out to be true and larger than you suspected. "These claims are legal," she said. "The county land office accepted them," Ethan said. "Whether they're enforceable if the property owners contest them is a different question." Bob said a lawyer could argue it either way. "We need to show this at the meeting," she said. "Today." "That's why I brought it," he said. She looked at him across the table. This man who'd ridden up a switchback road with a ceiling compound on a Tuesday in November and had been showing up in exactly the right way ever since, not filling space, but occupying it, not adding noise, but adding weight. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Walsh is going to be in that room." The Thursday meeting was different from the January meeting in ways Clara could feel the moment she walked in. The January meeting had been uncertain. Men coming in with their arms crossed and their verdicts already rendered, willing to listen, but not yet willing to believe. This room was different. This room had 7 failed wells and a stopped mill wheel, and 8 months of predictions that had come true on schedule, and the people in it had arrived already in the process of being convinced. Walsh was there. He was in the same back corner he'd occupied in January. But he was not alone. This time there were 4 men around him who had the particular look of people who've been told what to think and are working at maintaining it. Holcomb was not in the room, but Clara knew he was in town. She'd been told he was at the hotel on the main street, which meant word would reach him within the hour of whatever happened here. She let Carter open the meeting. He stood at the head of the table and talked about the mill in a way that was simple and direct and stripped of anything except the facts. It had stopped. The creek was the reason his father had built it, and he'd run it for 18 years, and it had never stopped for weather before. He said it without drama, and somehow that made it more dramatic than drama would have. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitmore." She stood. She put the water data on the table, the same way she'd done in January. Then she put Ethan's document beside it. "Before I go through the current conditions," she said, "I need to address something this valley has a right to know." She looked at Walsh. 3 weeks ago, a water speculator named Theodore Holcomb filed claims with the county land office on well sites covering 6 properties in this valley. Some of those properties belong to people in this room. The claims were filed on wells that don't exist, and on water rights the property owners never agreed to transfer. She held up the document. "I have the filing here. If your property is on this list, you should know that someone has claimed your water before you knew the claim was being made." The room broke apart. Not the controlled murmur of January. Something louder and harder, the sound of people who have just understood that the problem is not just the drought. 3 men stood up simultaneously. Samuel Greer's voice cut through the noise. "What's the name again?" "Theodore Holcomb," Clara said. "He came to Red Hollow from Denver 6 weeks ago. He's been staying at the hotel on Main Street." Walsh stood up. "Now wait. Sit down, Gerald." Carter's voice was flat and final. Walsh sat. Clara put the document on the table. "The filing is public record. Anyone in this room can verify it at the county land office. If your name is on this list, I'd suggest you do that today before this meeting is over, so you understand what you're dealing with." She paused. "I also want to say clearly, this scheme depends on the valley going into crisis without preparation. Every family in this room that has followed the conservation recommendations from January is not a target for this because they don't need what Holcomb is selling. Every family that hasn't is." She let that sit for a moment. "That is not an accusation. That is a description of how this works." The silence that followed was the heavy kind. Then Roy Dunmore said without getting up from the second row, "Walsh, did you know about this filing?" Walsh looked at Dunmore. He looked at the room. He looked at Clara. She watched him calculate, watched him measure the distance between what he'd planned and where he was standing now, with a room full of his neighbors, looking at him with that particular expression that comes when trust is being weighed and found wanting. "I have a business arrangement with Holcomb," Walsh said. "That's not illegal." "Claiming water rights on land that isn't yours might be," Carter said. "The legal questions are for lawyers." "Gerald." Eleanor Phipps had been in the room since the beginning, sitting beside Dale in the 3rd row. She hadn't said anything until now. Her voice was not loud, but it had the quality of something that cuts through. "My family's name is on that list." Walsh went still. "My land," Eleanor said. "My water. My 20 years on that north ridge with my husband and my children." She stood up, which she rarely did in public rooms. "You came to my son last fall and told him the woman on the cliff was causing unnecessary panic. My son didn't listen to you. And because he didn't listen, we built a catchment system last February, and my family has water today, when my neighbors on the west side are hauling." She looked at Walsh with the steady focus of a woman who has nothing left to be careful about. "You tell me why your name should mean more in this valley than your choices." Walsh opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The room made a sound that was not quite anything except the collective exhale of 25 people arriving at the same conclusion at the same time. After that, Walsh did not speak again for the rest of the meeting. Holcomb came to the land office the following Monday morning to find Carter already there with Clara's documentation and a letter from a Denver attorney Carter had telegraphed the previous week. The speculative water claims were challenged formally before noon. By Tuesday, 3 of the West Side landowners Walsh had convinced to wait out the drought had ridden to the cliff to ask about catchment systems. By Wednesday, Samuel Greer had told Clara he was sorry for making her wait on his porch. "You didn't have to come in," he said. "That day. You could have let us figure it out the hard way." "I thought about it," she said honestly. "Why didn't you?" She thought about her grandfather. She thought about knowledge that sits in a box until someone finds it too late. "Because a thing I know that could help and doesn't help isn't really knowledge," she said. "It's just a possession." Greer nodded slowly. He had the expression of a man filing something away permanently. Walsh left Red Hollow in the second week of May. He did not say goodbye to anyone, which told the valley everything it needed to know about whether he understood what he'd done. Holcomb left 2 days before Walsh, which told the valley the rest of it. The legal challenge to the water claims was resolved in June, with all speculative filings vacated, and 2 county ordinances subsequently proposed, one regulating speculative water claims, one establishing minimum documentation standards for well site rights. Clara had not set out to change county water law, but the document Ethan had brought to the table on Thursday morning turned out to be the kind of evidence that didn't stop at one meeting. It moved as evidence sometimes does when it arrives in the right room at the right time, into official channels and official records and official changes that would outlast everyone who'd been in that room. She found out about the ordinance proposals from Carter, who had been appointed to the advisory committee, who told her on a Tuesday evening when he came to the cliff to review the valley survey she'd completed in April. "They want your testimony," he said, "at the county hearing in July." She looked at him. "My testimony?" "The survey is going to be the primary evidence base for both ordinances," he said. "The committee wants the person who conducted it to speak to the methodology." She thought about a county hearing. She thought about a room that was larger than the mill floor, a room where the people who decided what the rules were would be listening to a 19-year-old widow from a cliff outside Red Hollow explain water table mechanics to them. She thought about her grandfather's journals. 20 years of careful observation that the world had ignored because it arrived from a man in a cabin talking to his horse. "Yes," she said, "I'll testify." Carter looked at her with an expression that had traveled a long way from the one he'd worn on her porch the week after James died. "There's something I want to say to you," he said. "Not as the man who's been working with you on this valley project. Personally." She waited. "I came to your house that first week," he said, "and I saw a young widow with no prospects in a hard country, and I tried to put you on a stagecoach to Denver. I thought that was me being helpful." He paused. "It was me being blind. I looked at you, and I saw the category instead of the person, and the category told me to look for someone to manage you. And I've thought about that. I think about it when I'm at the mill that stopped running, and the creek that's going dry, and the wells that are failing, all the things I didn't see coming, that you saw coming 8 months ago." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know I understand what I missed. And I want you to know that in my experience, 40 years in this county, I have never worked alongside any one man or woman who combined what you know with how you use it the way you do." The words found her in a place that had been waiting for them longer than she'd admitted to herself. She didn't perform grace about it. She didn't deflect or minimize. She received it the way Eleanor Phipps had taught her an apology was supposed to be received, as something the other person had earned the right to give, and that she had the right to accept. "Thank you," she said. "That means something to me." He nodded. "The survey. It should be your name on it." "It's my grandfather's name on it," she said, "with mine below." Carter was quiet for a moment. Then, "That seems right." He rode back down the switchback in the early evening, and Clara stood at the top of the first terrace. The finished one, the one she'd stood on in October, and looked out from and seen the creek running thin and pale, and known what was coming, and she looked out now at the valley below. June was 2 weeks away. The heat was real, and it was going to get worse before it got better. There were still families on the west side who hadn't fully made the transition, still decisions to be made, and problems to be solved, and months of hard summer ahead before anything could be called safe. But the valley was different now than it had been in September. Not saved, not fixed, but awake in a way it hadn't been aware of its own ground, in a way that comes from the particular education of nearly losing something, and from the particular grace of having someone nearby who'd spent a long time preparing to help when the moment came. Ethan came up the switchback that same evening later, when the air had cooled slightly and the stars were starting, and she was still on the terrace when she heard his horse. He came up beside her and stood looking out at the valley, and for a while Neither of them said anything, which was one of the things she valued most about him, that he understood the difference between a silence that needed filling and a silence that was its own kind of conversation. "The ordinance hearings," he said eventually. "Carter told you." "He told me they want your testimony." He paused. "I want to come with you, to the county hearing, if you'll let me." She looked at him. "Not to speak for you," he said quickly. "Not to I just want to be there, in the room. Because the things that matter to you." He stopped, found the words. "I want to be in the rooms where the things that matter to you happen. That's all." She thought about a room at the county seat with officials asking about water table methodology and survey documentation and the precedent for speculative water claims. And she thought about Ethan Walker sitting in that room with the steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything he decided mattered. "Come," she said. He nodded. The valley spread out below them in the dark, dry, and enduring, and still waiting, as the land always waits for the people on it to understand what it needed from them. Clara understood. She had understood for a long time, and now, finally, so did everyone else. The county seat was a 2-day ride from Red Hollow, and Clara spent the first day of the journey in a silence that Ethan respected without commenting on. She wasn't nervous. She'd settled that question early on the morning they left, standing in the cliff shelter with her grandfather's journals stacked beside her. Survey documentation, looking at 8 months of her own handwriting, layered over 20 years of his, and she'd understood that whatever happened in that hearing room, this evidence was real. It had always been real. The only thing that had ever been in question was whether the right people would be in the right room to receive it. She was going to make sure they were. What she was turning over in her mind during that first day's ride was something different. It was the particular weight of being about to do something permanent. The January meeting had changed the valley's immediate behavior. The county hearing, if it went the way Carter's attorney believed it could go, would change the county's law, would write into official record a set of protections that would exist past this drought, past this decade, past anyone currently alive who had a stake in it. That was her grandfather's life work, given a legal form he'd never lived to see. She felt the responsibility of that in a way that wasn't burden exactly, but wasn't light either. Ethan rode beside her and didn't fill the silence, and at the end of the first day when they stopped at a way station, he made coffee and handed her a cup and said only, "You've been running the testimony in your head all day." "Parts of it," she said. "Which parts?" "The part where they ask me how a 20-year-old woman with no formal education came to be the authority on this valley's water table," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What's your answer?" "The truth," she said. "That I'm not the authority. My grandfather was. I'm the person who read what he wrote and had the sense to believe it." "That's a good answer," he said. "It's the only answer I have," she said. "So it had better be good." He looked at her across the small fire, and she looked back, and she thought about what he'd said on the Millard Creek parcel. Someone you choose on purpose, and about the way that simple declaration had been true every day since, without either of them needing to say it again. That was the thing about Ethan Walker that she was still getting used to. He meant what he said the first time, and he didn't need to keep saying it to keep meaning it. "You're going to do something tomorrow that nobody in that county has ever done," he said. "I'm going to testify about hydrology," she said. "You're going to walk into a room full of men who make the rules, and you're going to change what the rules are," he said. "Because you were right, and you were prepared, and you didn't stop when people told you to." He paused. "Your grandfather would have, I think he would have been." "Don't," she said, but quietly, without sharpness. "Don't tell me what he would have felt. I can't know that. I just know what I'm going to do." Ethan nodded. He understood the distinction. He understood most of her distinctions, which was still a thing she was adjusting to. "Then go do it," he said. She did. The county hearing was held in the district courthouse in a room with high ceilings and tall windows and a long table at which 7 men sat, with the particular organized gravity of people who understand they are performing authority as much as exercising it. Clara had known rooms like this in the abstract, had imagined them during the months on the cliff, when she'd let herself think forward, past the drought, to what permanent change might look like. The reality of the room was smaller than her imagination, and more ordinary, which was steadying rather than disappointing. She sat at the witness table with her grandfather's journals and her survey documentation arranged in front of her, and she looked at the 7 men and they looked at her, and she watched them do the calculation, the same sequence, the same conclusion, and she let them finish it, and then she opened her mouth and she began. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. She presented the survey data in chronological order, her grandfather's original measurements from 1851 through 1871, her own measurements from March 1884 through June 1885, the comparative analysis that showed the rate of aquifer depletion and the projected recovery timeline under different land use scenarios. She explained the methodology in plain language that didn't condescend and didn't overcomplicate. She presented the well failure sequence, 7 failures on the predicted schedule, 2 additional failures within the margin of error she'd stated in January. She presented the creek measurements. She presented the mill cessation. Then she put Holcomb's water rights filing on the table. The speculative water rights claims filed in this county in March of 1885, she said, represent a category of legal instrument that currently has no county-level regulation. A speculator from Denver was able to file claims on well sites on properties he didn't own against water rights. The landowners had no knowledge were being claimed based on a drought prediction that the landowner who facilitated the arrangement had received from the January Valley meeting and chosen not to share with his neighbors. She paused. This is not an aberration. This is what happens in the absence of regulation. This drought will not be the last one. The next speculator who arrives in a crisis valley with capital and legal instruments will do the same thing and worse unless the county establishes what kinds of water claims require property owner consent and what kinds of prior documentation are necessary before a claim can be filed. The room was very quiet. The committee chairman, a man named Aldous Ferris, who had the look of someone who'd spent 30 years in rooms like this and was rarely surprised by anything, leaned forward. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, your survey documentation, this is based primarily on your grandfather's historical records. The baseline data is my grandfather's, she said, Thomas Pruitt. He surveyed the Red Hollow Valley water table from 1851 to 1871. The county has his name in its mining records from 1869 if you want to verify his presence in the territory. Ferris made a note. And your own measurements, conducted weekly from March 1884 through June 1885. Methodology identical to my grandfather's, documented in parallel in my own records. She opened her notebook to the first measurement page. You can compare his notation format with mine if there's any question about consistency. A man at the far end of the table, younger than the others, with the look of someone who'd been appointed to this committee recently and was still finding his footing, raised his hand. Mrs. Whitmore, you live alone on a cliff property outside Red Hollow. With my brother, she said. You're how old? 20, she said. As of March. He looked at the survey documentation in front of him. He looked at the journals. He looked at her. She watched something happen in his expression that she recognized as the moment when the category loses to the evidence. This survey, he said slowly, is more comprehensive than anything the county has in its own records. My grandfather was thorough, she said. Ferris leaned back in his chair. We're going to take a 30-minute recess, he said. I'd like the committee to review the documentation before we continue. Clara rose and walked out into the corridor where Ethan was waiting on a bench with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her face when she came out and said nothing, just stood, and she shook her head slightly to mean not yet. And he nodded, and they stood together in the corridor for 30 minutes, while 7 men in a room read 20 years of her grandfather's careful handwriting and 8 months of hers. When Ferris called her back and the energy of the room had changed. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, the committee has one final question before we conclude. You've proposed 2 specific ordinances, one requiring property owner consent for speculative water claims, one establishing documentation standards for new well filings. What you're describing would represent the most significant reform to county water law since the territory became a state. Yes, she said. You understand that there will be resistance. From land developers, from speculators, from people who profit from the current absence of regulation. I understand that, she said. I've been dealing with that kind of resistance for 2 years. Ferris studied her for a moment. Why did you bring this here? You could have protected your own property and your own community without coming to the county level. This is a larger fight than the one you needed to pick. She thought about her grandfather in his cabin with his 6 journals. All that knowledge sitting in a box waiting for someone to find it available to one person because it hadn't been made available to everyone. Because the next valley over from Red Hollow has the same water table patterns, she said, and the valley after that. And because a drought doesn't know county lines, and because what I know I learned from a man who spent 20 years writing down everything he understood about this land, and he died without anyone knowing what he'd written, and I have been the only person those journals helped for my entire life. She paused. I don't want that to be how useful information works. I want it to be in the record. I want it to be the county's knowledge, not just mine. The room was very quiet. Ferris made a note. He capped his pen. He looked at the 6 men beside him, and something passed between the 8 of them that didn't need words. The committee will deliberate, Ferris said. We'll have a determination within 2 weeks. She and Ethan rode back to Red Hollow in better time than the trip out, because the return always goes faster than the going. They didn't talk much. There wasn't a need to. The testimony was done, and the evidence was in, and the rest was in the hands of 7 men, and whatever they understood about the future. On the second day of the ride back, crossing the long, flat stretch before the valley opened up, Ethan said, Whatever they decide. Whatever they decide, she agreed. You did what you came to do. I put the information in the right room, she said. That's what my grandfather couldn't do. He looked at her sideways the way he'd gotten in the habit of looking at her when he was thinking something he was deciding whether to say. Say it, she said. I'm going to buy the Millard Creek parcel, he said. She waited. And I'd like to build something near the spring, he said. Something you'd want to come back to. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I know you have the cliff. I know you have the survey work and the county things and the Saturday training sessions and probably 4 more things I don't know about. I'm not asking you to stop any of it. He paused. I'm asking if there's room in the life you're building for the life I'm building. She rode for a moment in silence. She thought about the way she'd put James's coins on the land office counter with steady hands. She thought about the first night on the cliff, her back on hard ground, listening to Colorado quiet press down. She thought about the well auger breaking through to wet earth at 38 feet, and Eli's voice saying, Clara, come down here, and the feel of that moisture on her palm, real certain entirely hers. She thought about what it meant to choose something on purpose. Yes, she said. There's room. He nodded, and she could see the thing that crossed his face, the controlled version of something large. Good, he said. Build the house first, she said. Before the smithy expansion. Get the house right. He looked at her. You have opinions about the house. I have opinions about everything, she said. I know, he said, and the way he said it was not complaint. It was the furthest possible thing from complaint. They rode back into Red Hollow on a Thursday evening in late June, and the town they rode into was different from the town that had watched Clara walk out of the land office the previous September with a deed against her chest and laughter following her down the boardwalk. The difference wasn't visible exactly, wasn't a thing you could point to in any single element. The buildings were the same. The dust was the same. The heat was the same particular Colorado heat that had no interest in anyone's comfort. But the quality of the town had shifted in the way that places shift when something underground has changed. You feel it in the ground before you can name what's different. People looked up when she rode through. Not the calculating look, not the category assessment sequence she'd spent a year learning to absorb without breaking stride. A different kind of looking. The kind that carries recognition. Roy Dunmore was outside the feed store when she passed, and he tipped his hat. She nodded back. Frank Oates Carter's crew chief, who'd called her the sharpest engineer he'd worked with, raised a hand from across the street. She raised one back. Eleanor Phipps was coming out of the dry goods store, and she stopped and waited, and when Clara pulled up she said without preamble, "Dale finished the upper catchment on the North Ridge property. Hold 60 gallons in the first rain." "That's ahead of schedule," Clara said. "Dale works fast when he's motivated," Eleanor said. "He's motivated." She paused. "How'd it go at the county?" "I think well," Clara said. "We'll know in 2 weeks." Eleanor nodded. "Then, you need to know something." Clara waited. "Martha Hensley organized a Valley meeting while you were gone," Eleanor said. "Day before yesterday. Not about water, well about water, but different. She wanted to talk about what happens after the drought, when the creek comes back and the wells recover. She didn't want everyone to go back to the old patterns the minute the crisis was over." Clara had not expected this. Martha Hensley organized a meeting. She did. 14 families came. They want to establish a Valley Water Council, something permanent that monitors the aquifer and manages the creek draw and keeps records the way you've been keeping records. Eleanor's eyes were direct. "They want you to chair it." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her grandfather, whose records had survived him in a box nobody opened for 20 years. She thought about knowledge that persisted and knowledge that died with the person who held it, and about the difference between those two outcomes and what made the difference. A council, permanent records, institutional continuity. Her grandfather had done his work alone. She didn't have to. "Tell Martha yes," she said. Eleanor almost smiled. "I already told her you'd say yes," she said. "I told her 2 days ago." "Then why did you ask?" "Because it's polite to ask even when you know the answer," Eleanor said, and walked back toward her horse with the particular efficiency of a woman who always has the next thing to get to. Clara rode to the cliff and found Eli on the upper terrace, in the middle of explaining something to 3 people she didn't recognize, a man and a woman about her age and an older man with the look of a farmer who'd traveled some distance. Eli saw her come up and lifted a hand in acknowledgement without breaking what he was saying, and she stood at the edge of the terrace and listened. He was explaining the cistern drainage system. He was doing it in the patient, exact language she'd heard him develop over the past 3 months. The teacher's manner, Eleanor had identified the capacity to put complex things in simple form without making the person receiving them feel like the simplification was a condescension. He'd gotten better at it than she'd expected. Better probably than she was at it herself, because Eli had a quality she'd always known he had, but hadn't thought to use this way. He made people feel capable rather than instructed. When he finished, the older man asked a question about aquifer depth, and Eli answered it accurately, and then said, "Mrs. Whitmore just got back from the county seat. She can tell you more about the legal protection side of it when she's had a minute." He nodded toward her. The 3 visitors turned. Clara looked at them. They were strangers to Red Hollow, she was certain of that. "You're not from the valley," she said. "No, ma'am," the younger man said. "We're from Cutter's Creek, about 40 miles east. We heard someone told us there was a woman up here who knew about drought preparation and water systems. Our valley's starting to show the same patterns yours did last fall." 40 miles east. A year ago, Clara had been trying to get the town of Red Hollow to listen to what she knew. Now the knowledge was moving on its own, traveling 40 miles without her carrying it. She thought about something her grandfather had written in the 3rd journal in the margins of a page about creek drainage. The only thing that travels farther than water is information about water. She'd thought he was being poetic. He was being accurate. "Come inside," she said. "I'll get you the survey methodology and walk you through the early indicators. Your valley has its own data. I'll need to understand your geology before I can tell you what's specific to your situation." The 3 visitors looked at each other with the expression of people who'd ridden 40 miles, not entirely sure they'd find what they were looking for, and have found more than they expected. "Thank you, ma'am," the older man said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We have a lot of work to do first." The county determination came on a Wednesday, 12 days after the hearing. Carter brought the letter himself. He came up the switchback road in the early morning, which was becoming a characteristic of his arriving early, unannounced when the news was significant enough to warrant his own delivery of it. She saw him come, and she went out to meet him, and he handed her the letter without saying what it said, because he wanted her to read it herself. She unfolded it. Both ordinances had passed. The Speculative Water Claims Ordinance requiring written consent from property owners before any water rights could be filed on their land, with county verification required before filing was accepted, had passed unanimously. The Documentation Standards Ordinance requiring survey verification of aquifer data before well permits could be issued using methodology that was explicitly based on her grandfather's survey standards had passed 5-2. At the bottom of the determination in Ferris's handwriting was a note. It said, "The committee recommends that the Thomas Pruitt Survey of the Red Hollow Valley Water Table, 1851 to 1871, updated by Clara Whitmore, 1884 to 1885, be formally entered into the county's permanent record as the baseline documentation for all future water management decisions in this region." Her grandfather's name in the county record. She read it twice. Then she folded the letter and held it against her chest. Not against her heart exactly, but against the place where she kept things that mattered most. The same place she'd held the deed to the Cliff property on the day she'd walked out of the land office into the laughter. Carter was watching her. "He was right about the land," she said. "He was right about all of it. He just needed someone to put it in the right room." "You put it in the right room," Carter said. "I carried it there," she said. "He built it." Carter was quiet for a moment. "What will you do with this?" She looked at the cliff, at the terraces, at the expanded cistern that held 320 gallons, and had been drawn down and refilled 4 times since the spring serving, not just her family and Eli, but the Dunmore stock and the Phipps North Ridge system, and the 3 families from the east side who'd been coming weekly since May. She looked at everything she had built. Then she thought about the 3 visitors from Cutter's Creek who had gone home 2 days ago with copies of the survey methodology and a hand-drawn diagram of the catchment system and instructions for how to read early aquifer stress indicators that Eli had written out in his clear, careful script. "The same thing I've been doing," she said, "but further." In August the rain came back. Not the drought-breaking downpour of legend. Not a single dramatic storm that ended everything at once. It came the way good things tend to come, when you've stopped waiting for them quietly over several days, small amounts that built on each other, the aquifer receiving what it had been waiting for, the creek rising inch by inch back toward the September mark. Clara measured it. The morning the creek crossed back above her original mark, the scratch she'd made with her pocket knife on the first day of September, 1884, measuring the start of everything, she stood at the ford with the cold water running over her boots and looked at the line and felt the particular emotion that comes when a long effort reaches a place that isn't an ending but is real rest. Eli was with her. He'd ridden out early when she'd told him she was going to check the creek because he understood what it meant and because he was at 17, the kind of person who shows up for the significant moments without needing to be asked. He looked at the water line. "Above the mark," he said. "1.5 inches," she said. He was quiet. Then, "We made it." "The valley made it," she said. "Because of you." She thought about that. She thought about Carter writing things down with his own pencil at his own table. She thought about Eleanor Phipps standing up in a public meeting and naming a wrong with the weight of someone who meant it. She thought about Roy Dunmore asking, "What do I do?" in a voice that had come out of him against his will, and Bert Coulter riding in dusty and proud and asking the same thing a different way, and Dale Phipps coming home to tell his mother that he'd found someone who said her knowledge of the land mattered. She thought about Frank Oates calling her an engineer when she'd been asking him to call her a designer. She thought about Eli himself, this boy who had climbed a cliff with her when he had every reason not to, who had stood beside her for a year without complaint and had become someone serious and capable and entirely himself. "Because of a lot of people," she said, "who decided to trust the information when the information was hard to hear." Eli looked at the creek for a long moment. What did grandfather think was going to happen to this valley? She had thought about this. She had thought about it many times in the late-night quiet of the cliff shelter with the journals open in front of her, trying to understand what a man wrote toward when he wrote the way Thomas Pruitt had written. With that kind of patience, that kind of precision, that kind of faith in observation, as an act of love toward a place. "I think he thought someone would find it," she said. "I think he wrote it all down because he believed that the right person would find it at the right time." "And that was you," Eli said. "That was me," she said. She pulled her boot out of the creek and stood up straight and looked at the valley, all of it, the full spread of it in the August morning, dry-grassed and heat-dusted and improbably stubbornly alive. And she thought about all the things that had needed to happen to bring her to this ford on this morning, measuring a water line with a pocketknife scratch. James dying. The cliff. The laughter. The cold first night on hard ground. The well breaking through at 38 feet. The chisel Ethan had made her. The January meeting. Walsh's cruelty. Holcomb's scheme. Carter's pencil. Eleanor's apology. The county room with its high windows and the 7 men who had read her grandfather's handwriting, and her own, and found them sufficient. None of it had been what she would have chosen. All of it had been exactly what it needed to be. She put the pocketknife back in her coat. In September, Ethan broke ground on the Millard Creek house. He'd asked her before he finalized the plans to look at what he'd drawn. Not to approve it, he was clear about that he didn't need her approval. He had his own judgment, but because he wanted her to look at a thing he'd built in his mind and tell him what she saw. She'd looked at the plans for a long time. "The spring room," she said. "The room that faces the spring." "What about it?" "Make it larger," she said. "Put a desk in it. South-facing windows for the light." He looked at the plans. He looked at her. "A desk," he said. "Someone's going to be doing survey work there," she said. "They're going to need the light." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pencil and adjusted the wall. That October, the Red Hollow Valley Water Council held its first formal meeting with Clara Whitmore as chair and 14-member families and a permanent record system modeled on Thomas Pruitt's methodology. The council would meet quarterly. It would maintain ongoing aquifer measurements. It would review any proposed changes to land use within the valley's watershed. It would keep the kind of records that survived their keepers, that lived in a county archive, rather than a box that belonged to the place, rather than to the person. The first item on the first meeting's agenda was the formal adoption of the survey documentation standards into the council's charter. Clara presented the standards. Carter seconded the adoption. Eleanor Phipps called the vote. 14-0. She walked back to the cliff that evening along the road she'd walked 100 times. The road that had once felt like exile, and now felt like the center of everything. And she thought about what it meant to have built something that would outlast you. Her grandfather had built it first in 6 leather-bound journals, in a cabin where nobody came to visit. She had carried it forward in 8 months of measurements and meetings, and a deed held against her chest on the day the laughter followed her down the boardwalk. Now it belonged to the valley. Now it could not be lost. The cliff caught the last of the evening light, the way it always did. The pale sandstone holding the warmth longer than anything around it. The overhang casting its shadow across the shelf, where the terraces were, where the cistern sat full and winter-ready, where her grandfather's knowledge had become her hand's work, and her hand's work had become the valley's future. She stood at the top of the first terrace and looked out at everything she'd had the courage to see when everyone around her was certain there was nothing to see. This was what she had understood from the beginning, the thing she had known before she'd signed the deed, before she'd thrown the coins on the counter, before the laughter, before all of it. The land doesn't care what you look like when you read it right. The land doesn't care how old you are, or how much grief you're carrying, or what the town has decided you are. The land only asks whether you're paying attention. Clara Whitmore had been paying attention her whole life, and everything she had paid attention to, every measurement, every calculation, every hard conversation, every moment she had stood in a room full of doubt and said what she knew had brought the valley to the other side of its worst year alive and more prepared than it had ever been for whatever came next. She was 20 years old. She was just getting started, And the cliff that everyone had called worthless, the land that no reasonable person would choose, the place where a fat young widow had gone to fail in the Colorado heat. That cliff stood behind her now, like a declaration, like evidence, like the answer to every question anyone had ever raised